March 21, 1886 marked the final hours of peace for the settlement of Tascosa, Texas, a location defined not by its architecture but by the raw, abrasive friction between corporate capital and the desperate men who worked the herds. Situated on the north bank of the Canadian River in Oldham County, the town sat isolated in the vast expanse of the Panhandle, a solitary island of commerce and vice surrounded by millions of acres of open range. The nearest railhead lay over 200 miles away in Dodge City, leaving Tascosa as the sole hub for supplies, legal disputes, and debauchery for a radius that stretched days in every direction. The isolation fostered a unique lawlessness not born of negligence, but of a distinct social hierarchy that had fractured into two warring factions ready to dismantle one another. On this specific night, the temperature hovered in the cool range typical of early spring in the high plains, keeping the mud tacky and the air crisp, enough to carry the sound of a pistol hammer clicking back for hundreds of yards. The geography of Tascosa itself facilitated the division that fueled the coming violence. The town was physically split into two distinct sections. The upper town housed the respectable businesses, the courthouse, the post office, and the stone residence of the wealthier merchants like Reinhardt and McMasters. It was a place of commerce where ledgers were balanced and land deeds were filed. However, a short distance to the east, separated by a stretch of scrub and sand, lay the district known universally as Hog Town. This cluster of adobe buildings, roughly constructed saloons and brothels, served as the drain for the region's excess wages and aggression. Hogtown was not merely a red light district, it was the stronghold of the system. This term referred to a loose but heavily armed confederation of small ranch owners, former cowboys, gamblers, and rustlers who had banded together to resist the dominance of the large cattle syndicates. Tension in the region had been mounting steadily since the cowboy strike of 1883. The failure of that labor movement had left hundreds of men unemployed and blacklisted by the major outfits. Denied honest work, these men turned to mavericking, the practice of branding unbranded calves found on the open range. While the large ranches considered this theft, the local population of Tascosa, comprised largely of these small operators, viewed it as a legitimate survival tactic against monopolistic corporations. This economic disparity created a powder keg where political allegiance was determined by the brand on a man's horse. The large ranches, specifically the LS, the LIT, and the XIT, wielded their power through hired gunmen and aggressive legal tactics, while the system controlled the local juries and the chaotic streets of Hogtown. Sheriff Jim East, a man who had notably participated in the capture of Billy the Kid in late 1880, walked the line between these two forces. His authority was recognized, but in the muddy thoroughfares of Hogtown it was often theoretical. The sheer volume of armed men passing through Tascosa on any given night made total enforcement impossible. Cowboys arriving from the trail carried heavy ordnance as a matter of professional necessity. The Colt single-action Army revolver, typically chambered in .45 caliber or .44-40 to match their Winchester rifles, was the standard sidearm. These were not ornamental weapons, they were tools worn smooth by daily handling, their holsters often modified for faster access. The presence of such weaponry meant that every verbal dispute carried the immediate potential for lethal escalation. By late afternoon on March 21st, the atmosphere in Hogtown was already dense with the smell of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and the sour mash of cheap whiskey. The saloon operated by Jenkins, a central hub of activity in the lower town, began to fill with the usual patrons. Among them were key figures of the system. Men like Lem Woodruff, a former employee of the LS Ranch who had switched sides to join the small operators, held court at the bar. Woodruff was a man well liked by the locals, known for his generosity with money when he had it, and his deep-seated resentment of the corporate ranch managers. His presence in Hogtown was a constant signal of defiance against his former employers. Mingling with Woodruff were other hard-edged characters who formed the muscle of the system. The Catfish Kid, a young and volatile gunman, moved through the crowds with a swagger that belied his age. His reputation for unpredictability made him a dangerous element in any confrontation. Louis Boozman and Charlie Emery, both stalwarts of the local resistance against the big ranchers, drank alongside him. These men did not view themselves as criminals, but as independent operators fighting a range war against foreign capital and absentee landlords. They wore their hats low and their revolvers high on their hips, their eyes constantly scanning the entrances of the adobe buildings. The layout of the Jenkins Saloon, with its heavy wooden bar and scattered tables, offered little cover in the event of a firefight, a fact that every man in the room understood implicitly. The animosity was directed specifically toward the LS Ranch and its manager, W.M.D. Lee. The LS had recently escalated its tactics against the rustlers, hiring a group of men specifically to function as regulators. These were not ordinary cowhands hired to push cattle. They were gunmen on the payroll to enforce company will and intimidate the maverickers. The locals referred to them as detectives or rangers with a sneer of contempt. Rumors circulated through the muddy streets of Tascosa that the LS regulators were planning a sweep, a decisive action to crush the system once and for all. This rumor mill churned constantly, fed by the arrival of every dusty rider bringing news from the outlying camps. The physical environment of Hogtown reflected the grit of its inhabitants. The buildings were constructed of adobe bricks, dried mud and straw that could stop a pistol ball but would crumble under sustained rifle fire. The floors were often packed earth or rough-hewn planks, stained with the refuse of countless nights of drinking. Lighting came from kerosene lamps that cast long, flickering shadows and filled the air with oily soot. Ventilation was poor, and on a busy night the air became thick with smoke and the heat of gathered bodies. Behind the saloons lay alleyways cluttered with empty crates, woodpiles, and debris, creating a maze of hazards and hiding spots that would become crucial in the hours to follow. As the sun dipped below the horizon on March 21st, the temperature dropped, and the wind picked up, rattling the loose window panes of the saloons. The nocturnal rhythm of Tascosa took over. Piano music, disjointed and often out of tune, competed with the raucous laughter of the gamblers and the shouts of the barkeeps. In the back rooms, games of Monte and poker operated with high stakes. Gold coins, silver dollars, and crumpled banknotes changed hands rapidly. A man could lose a month's wages in the span of 10 minutes. This financial volatility added another layer of stress to men already on edge. Alcohol served as the primary fuel for the evening. The whiskey served in Hogtown was often of low quality, high in proof and laced with additives to give it color and kick. It stripped the inhibition from men who were already prone to violence. The women of Hogtown, the demi-monde, as they were politely termed in the press, navigated this dangerous landscape with practiced caution. They worked the dance halls and the back rooms, their presence serving as both a comfort and a catalyst for jealousy among the patrons. On this particular night, the interactions between the women and the cowboys were underscored by the factional loyalty that divided the town. A woman seen favoring an LS man might draw the ire of a system loyalist, adding sexual rivalry to the existing political and economic feud. In the upper town, the respectable citizens locked their doors and shuttered their windows. They knew the rhythms of the lower town well enough to sense when the energy shifted from rowdy to dangerous. Sheriff East and his deputies patrolled the buffer zone, wary of intervening too aggressively in Hogtown unless absolutely necessary. The jail, a sturdy stone structure, was already hosting a few drunks, but it was ill-equipped to handle a mass riot. East knew that if the LS regulators rode into town in force, the fragile peace would shatter. He had warned the ranch managers about sending their enforcers into the stronghold of the system, but his warnings were largely ignored by men who believed that might made right on the frontier. The sheer scale of the cattle industry that underpinned this conflict cannot be overstated. Millions of dollars of livestock roamed the panhandle. The LS Ranch alone claimed rights to tens of thousands of head of cattle and hundreds of thousands of acres of grazing land. This immense wealth required protection, and the men chosen to protect it were selected for their ability to shoot straight and without hesitation. The system conversely relied on the sheer number of disaffected locals. They knew the terrain, they had the support of the populace, and they had nowhere else to go. For them, this was a fight for their homes and their way of life. Inside Jenkins' saloon, Lem Woodruff ordered another round. He checked the load in his revolver, a habit born of years on the range. The cylinder spun freely, the brass casings of the cartridges gleaming in the dim light. Beside him, the Catfish Kid sharpened a knife on the leather of his boot, the rasping sound lost in the din of the room. They were waiting. They did not know the exact hour or the specific faces that would appear, but they knew the LS men were coming. The unspoken declaration of war hung heavy in the room, more potent than the smoke or the whiskey fumes. The infrastructure of the town provided significant tactical disadvantages for any attacking force. To enter Hogtown, one had to ride down the main thoroughfare, which acted as a funnel. The adobe buildings on either side provided excellent cover for defenders while leaving the street wide open to crossfire. The back alleys were narrow and dark, perfect for ambushes. The system men knew every corner, every loose board in the fence, and every exit. The LS regulators, should they arrive, would be entering hostile territory where every shadow could conceal a gunman. As the clock ticked past 9 in the evening, the crowd in Hogtown grew denser. Ranch hands from the smaller outfits trickled in, shaking the dust from their coats. They brought news of the range, water holes drying up, herd movements, and the sightings of LS patrols. Every report added to the pile of grievances. The narrative in the saloon was singular and reinforcing. The big ranches were squeezing the little man, and it was time to push back. The alcohol amplified this sentiment, turning grumbling into loud proclamations of defiance. The weaponry present in the saloon that night represented the pinnacle of 19th century small arms technology. The Winchester Model 1873, often called the gun that won the West, was ubiquitous. Its lever-action mechanism allowed for rapid fire, and because it often shared ammunition with the Colt revolver, a man only needed to carry one type of cartridge. This logistical advantage meant that a firefight could be sustained with high intensity. The heavy slugs thrown by these weapons were capable of penetrating light cover and inflicting massive trauma. There was no concept of stopping power in the modern sense. There was only the brutal physics of a large projectile transferring energy into a target. Around 10 o'clock, the wind died down slightly, leaving a heavy silence outside that contrasted with the noise inside. The moon, waning but still bright enough to cast illumination on the sand, rose over the plains. It lit the path from the upper town to Hogtown, a path that would soon be traveled by the men of the LS. The distance between the two sections of town was only a few hundred yards, but in social and political terms it was a chasm. Crossing it that night required a deliberate intention to engage. The men of the system were not a formal army. They lacked uniforms and a central command structure. However, their cohesion was forged by shared hardship and a common enemy. Lem Woodruff acted as a de facto leader, his experience giving him authority. He spoke in low tones to the men around him, coordinating their positions without making a show of it. If trouble started, they knew where to go. They claimed the corners of the room, the spots with the best sightlines. It was a defensive posture taken by men who expected an attack. The sensory details of the saloon were overwhelming. The taste of dust was omnipresent, gritty between the teeth. The visual field was a haze of brown and gray, brown adobes, gray smoke, dark clothing. The auditory landscape was a cacophony of fiddle music, boots on wood, glass clinking, and the distinctive rhythmic thud of a heavy door closing. Every time the entrance to Jenkins' saloon opened, heads turned. Hands drifted closer to holsters. Eyes narrowed to assess the newcomer. Was it a friend, a neutral cowboy, or a regulator? This heightened state of alertness burned energy. Men ate pickled eggs and salted meat from jars on the bar to keep their strength up. They drank water from the communal bucket, disregarding hygiene. Survival was the priority, not health. The anticipation was a physical weight, tightening muscles and quickening pulses. It was the biological preparation for combat, the body flooding with adrenaline in response to the perceived threat. The grievances of the system were not entirely without merit. The large ranches had indeed used their financial power to monopolize water rights and fence off public lands. They had used the legal system to harass small competitors. But the response of the system, organized theft and intimidation, had escalated the conflict beyond a legal dispute into a guerrilla war. Tascosa was the battlefield where these two ideologies would collide. The town was too small to contain both the corporate ambition of the LS and the rugged independence of the system. By midnight, the crowd had thinned slightly as the less committed drinkers went home to their bedrolls. The hardcore remained. These were the men who would not back down, the men who had staked their reputation on resisting the big outfits. The air in the saloon grew stale, the oxygen depleted by the lamps and the lungs of the patrons. Outside, the street was empty, a strip of pale dirt flanked by dark buildings. The shadows stretched long and deep, providing ample concealment for anyone approaching from the upper town. The stage was fully set. The geography, the politics, the weaponry, and the personalities were all in place. The system held the ground. They were dug in at Jenkins' saloon and the surrounding buildings. They had the numbers and the defensive advantage. The LS faction, though not yet present in the narrative of the night, was the opposing force that physics demanded. An object at rest stays at rest until acted upon by an outside force. The system was the object at rest, heavy and immovable. The LS regulators were the force speeding toward them. In the quiet moments between songs, the men in Hogtown could hear the distant lowing of cattle held in pens near the river. It was a reminder of the commodity that drove the violence. Cows were money, and money was power. The struggle for that power had stripped away the veneer of civilization in Tascosa, leaving only the raw struggle for dominance. The laws of the state of Texas were distant abstractions. The laws of physics and ballistics were the only statutes that would hold court before the sun rose. The date, March 21st, was rapidly slipping away, transitioning into the early hours of the 22nd. But for the men in the saloon, time was measured in drinks and hand after hand of cards. They were suspended in the moment before the crash, the intake of breath before the scream. The powder keg of the panhandle was primed. The fuse lay exposed, waiting for the spark that would come in the form of 4 men riding down from the upper town. The inevitability of the clash was clear to anyone paying attention. It was not a question of if, but when. And when was now only a matter of minutes. The 4 men representing the interests of the LS ranch mounted their horses under the cover of the deepening night, preparing to traverse the short but politically charged distance that separated their camp from the heart of Tascosa. Ed King sat at the front of the formation, his posture relaxed but commanding, a reflection of his status as the premier regulator for the syndicate. He rode a bay gelding that shifted its weight nervously, its hooves churning the damp soil near the hitching rail. King adjusted the brim of his hat, pulling it low to shield his eyes from the biting wind that swept across the open plains. His attire was practical and expensive, consisting of a heavy woolen coat buttoned to the throat and trousers reinforced with leather to withstand the friction of the saddle. At his hip, a Colt revolver rested in a holster that had been oiled recently. The leather supple and dark. He was a man who projected an aura of invulnerability, a fatal flaw that often accompanied men who had survived too many close encounters. Flanking King was Frank Valley, a man whose reputation for violence was well known throughout the Panhandle. Valley rode a sorrel with a white blaze, a horse that seemed to match his own volatile temperament. He checked his equipment with a rhythmic precision, sliding his Winchester rifle halfway out of its leather scabbard to ensure it would draw smoothly if required. The brass receiver of the weapon caught the faint moonlight, gleaming dully against the dark backdrop of the night. Valley was smaller in stature than King, but possessed a kinetic energy that made him appear larger. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon, searching for threats in the shadows of the cottonwood trees. He wore a canvas duster that flapped in the wind, the fabric stiff and noisy, adding a layer of auditory chaos to their movement. Fred Chilton rode to the left, a steady and reliable presence in the group. He was less flamboyant than King or Valley, a working man who had taken up the role of regulator out of loyalty and necessity. His mount was a sturdy roan, built for endurance rather than speed. Chilton carried himself with a quiet grimness, understanding the gravity of entering a town that had effectively declared war on his employer. He kept his hands gloved against the chill, the reins wrapped loosely around his fingers. His firearm was a standard-issue Colt, the bluing worn off the barrel from years of friction against the holster. He did not speak as they prepared to move, his focus entirely on the task of navigating the terrain and backing up his companions. Bringing up the rear was John Lang, the youngest of the quartet and perhaps the most observant. Lang rode a dark horse that blended almost perfectly into the surrounding darkness. He was the only one of the four who seemed to fully appreciate the tactical disadvantage they were riding into. While King exuded confidence and Valley radiated aggression, Lang emitted a sense of caution. He constantly checked his back trail, ensuring they were not being followed from the ranch lands. His gear was meticulous. His cartridge belt was fully looped with .45 caliber rounds, the copper cases tarnished but clean of grit. He kept his rifle scabbard positioned for a right-hand draw, the stock of the weapon worn smooth by his grip. Lang's role was to watch the flanks, a duty he performed with a seriousness that bordered on paranoia. The group spurred their horses forward, leaving the relative safety of the LS dugout and heading toward the lights of Tascosa. The sound of 16 hooves striking the earth created a dull, rhythmic thrumming that resonated through the ground. The soil in this part of the Panhandle was a mixture of sand and clay, which deadened the noise slightly but did not silence it. As they picked up speed, the wind rushed past their ears, carrying with it the scents of the river and the distant smoke from the town's chimneys. The ride was not long in terms of miles, but the psychological distance was immense. They were leaving the jurisdiction of the ranch, where their word was law, and entering a municipality where they were viewed as foreign invaders. As they approached the outskirts of the town, the terrain became more treacherous. The path was rutted by the wheels of freight wagons and eroded by the spring rains. The horses had to pick their way carefully to avoid stepping in holes that could snap a cannon bone. The men guided their mounts with subtle shifts of their weight and light pressure on the reins, their bodies moving in sync with the animals. This equestrian skill was second nature to them, born of years in the saddle, but tonight it was applied with a heightened sense of urgency. A stumbling horse in a hostile zone could mean death, not from the fall, but from the vulnerability it created. They entered Tascosa from the west, passing the first few scattered structures of the upper town. Here, the buildings were dark, the respectable citizens having long since retired or barricaded themselves inside. The McMaster's store stood silent, its windows barred and its heavy wooden doors padlocked. The Exchange Hotel showed a few lights in the upper windows, but the lobby was dim. The hooves of the regulators' horses clattered loudly as they transitioned from the soft dirt of the trail to the harder packed earth of the main street. This change in acoustics announced their arrival to anyone listening. The sound echoed off the stone facades, a stark challenge to the silence of the residential district. Ed King slowed his horse to a walk as they reached the center of the upper town. He sat tall in the saddle, making no attempt to conceal his presence. It was a deliberate display of power. He wanted the town to know that the LS men were not afraid to ride the streets. Valley mimicked his leader's pace, his hand resting casually on his thigh, inches from his pistol. Chilton and Lang closed the gap, forming a tight box formation. They rode 4 abreast where the street width allowed, dominating the thoroughfare. The few pedestrians who were still out, mostly transient laborers or late-night travelers, quickly stepped aside, pressing themselves against the walls of the buildings to give the regulators a wide berth. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. Get out of the way. The regulators continued their progress, moving past the courthouse. The stone building loomed in the darkness, a symbol of a legal system that had failed to resolve the conflict between the ranchers and the rustlers. To the men of the LS, the courthouse was a useless monument. True justice was dispensed from the barrel of a Winchester. To the men of the system, it was a tool of oppression used by the rich to steal land. The regulators ignored the structure, their eyes fixed on the path ahead that descended toward the lower town. The divide between the two sections of Tascosa was marked by a stretch of open ground, a no-man's land of scrub brush and trash that separated the stone buildings of the elite from the adobe slums of the workers. Crossing this buffer zone, the atmosphere changed palpably. The air grew thicker with the smells of coal smoke, unwashed bodies, and stale alcohol. The lights of Hogtown appeared ahead, yellow squares of kerosene illumination cutting through the blackness. The sound of the piano from the Jenkins Saloon drifted toward them, a disjointed melody that grew louder with every step. The horses sensed the tension, their ears swiveling back and forth. They could smell the other horses tied at the hitching rails in Hogtown, and they could smell the aggression that permeated the area. King's Bay snorted, tossing its head, but King checked it with a firm hand, forcing the animal to maintain a steady, intimidating walk. The regulators did not rush this final leg of the journey. They wanted their approach to be seen. They wanted the men in the saloons to have time to realize who was coming. It was a psychological tactic designed to provoke fear, but in the volatile climate of Tascosa, it was just as likely to provoke a preemptive strike. As they neared the first buildings of the lower town, the darkness of the alleys seemed to deepen. These narrow passages between the adobes were choked with shadows, offering perfect concealment for a sniper. Lang scanned these danger zones intensely, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom. He looked for the glint of metal, the glow of a cigarette, or the silhouette of a hat brim, anything that would indicate an ambush. The street in Hogtown was narrower than in the upper town, the buildings encroaching on the roadway. The regulators were forced to break their 4 abreast formation, shifting into a loose single file with King at the lead. This formation was tactically inferior, exposing each man individually, but the architecture gave them no choice. King rode with his head high, looking neither left nor right, demonstrating a disdain for the danger that bordered on arrogance. He believed that his reputation alone would freeze any hand that reached for a gun. It was a belief system that had served him well in previous encounters, but tonight, the variables had shifted. They passed the first few saloons, ignoring the jeers that drifted out from the open doors. The voices were slurred, shouting insults at the LS pimps and corporate dogs. King did not flinch. He kept his eyes focused on their destination, the Jenkins Saloon. This was the nerve center of the opposition, the place where the system leadership congregated. By riding directly to Jenkins, King was issuing a direct challenge to Lem Woodruff and the Catfish Kid. He was walking into the lion's den not to negotiate, but to assert dominance. Arriving at the front of the Jenkins Saloon, the regulators pulled their horses to a halt. The area in front of the building was crowded with other mounts, the hitching rail fully occupied. King dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He tied his horse to a post, taking his time to secure the knot. He patted the animal's neck, a gesture of affection that contrasted sharply with the violence of his profession. Valley, Chilton, and Long followed suit, dismounting and securing their animals. They stood for a moment in a cluster, adjusting their coats and checking their weapons one last time. The physical act of dismounting signaled the end of the ride and the beginning of the confrontation on the ground. They were no longer cavalry. They were infantry entering a fortress. The gear they carried seemed heavier now that they were on foot. The weight of the cartridge belts pressed down on their hips. The long coats necessary for the ride felt cumbersome and restricting for a close-quarters fight. Yet none of them removed their outer garments. The coats offered a degree of protection, or at least concealment, hiding the exact position of their hands and the number of weapons they carried. King brushed the dust from his sleeves, a fastidious motion that seemed absurd given the circumstances. He looked at his men, making eye contact with each of them. There was no need for a pep talk. They knew the stakes. The exterior of the Jenkins Saloon was humble, a low adobe structure with a flat roof and thick walls. The door was made of rough planks currently closed against the night air. Light spilled out from the cracks in the wood, and the noise from inside was a dull roar. The regulators could hear individual voices now, recognizing the distinctive timbre of men they had clashed with on the range. The proximity to the enemy was zero. They were separated only by a few inches of wood. John Lang took a position slightly to the side of the door, ensuring he had a clear view of the street in both directions. He did not like the setup. The street was too quiet, the shadows too deep. He felt the eyes of unseen watchers on him. He knew that in a town like this, the enemy was not just inside the saloon, but potentially in every window and doorway facing the street. He loosened the thong on his holster, slipping it off the hammer of his Colt. It was a small, silent preparation that could mean the difference between drawing in half a second or getting snagged and dying. Frank Valley was practically vibrating with adrenaline. He paced a small circle near the hitching rail, his boots crunching in the dirt. He wanted to kick the door in, to force the action. His aggression was a weapon, but it was also a liability. King placed a hand on Valley's shoulder, a silent command to hold steady. They would enter on King's terms, not in a chaotic rush. King took a deep breath of the cold night air, filling his lungs with the oxygen he would need for the coming exertion. He stepped toward the door, his hand reaching for the latch. The transition from the saddle to the ground had changed the dynamic. On horseback, they were imposing figures elevated above the common man. On the ground, they were just four men standing in the dirt, vulnerable to a bullet from any direction. The horses, sensing the change in their riders, shifted nervously, their metal bits clinking softly. This metallic sound was the only noise the regulators made as they prepared to breach the sanctuary of the system. The ride was over. The distance had been closed. The LS regulators had successfully navigated the hostile terrain of the lower town and delivered themselves to the doorstep of their enemies. The physical journey was complete, but the true trial was just beginning. The silence outside the saloon was a deception, a thin veneer over the violence that was coiling to strike. King pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped across the threshold. The light from the interior swallowed him, followed closely by Valley and Chilton. Lang lingered for a fraction of a second longer, taking one last look at the dark street, imprinting the location of the best cover into his mind. Then he too stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind them, sealing them in the cage with the beast. The journey of the regulators on this night was a testament to their brazen confidence. They had not sneaked into town. They had ridden down the center of the street. They had not hidden their horses in the back. They had tied them out front. Every action was a calculated insult to the system, a declaration that the LS feared no one. This arrogance was the fuel that would ignite the events to come. The horses waited outside, their breath steaming in the cold air, indifferent to the fate of the men who had ridden them. The leather of the saddles began to cool, the warmth of the riders fading into the chill of the Texas night. Inside the saloon, the presence of the regulators was immediately felt, a disturbance in the ecosystem of the room. But outside, the street returned to a deceptive stillness. The wind blew dust over the hoofprints the LS horses had left, slowly erasing the evidence of their arrival. The town of Tascosa waited, holding its breath, listening for the sound that would inevitably follow the ride of the regulators. The ride had been the fuse, the destination was the explosive. And now the two had met. The interior of Jenkins' saloon assaulted the senses of the four LS regulators the moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them. The transition from the crisp, cold air of the open panhandle night to the superheated, smoke-choked atmosphere of the barroom was jarring. A haze of blue-gray tobacco smoke hung in a thick, distinct stratum just above head height, trapping the heat generated by the press of bodies and the numerous kerosene lamps mounted on the adobe walls. The smell was a complex layering of unwashed wool, stale beer, cheap perfume, and the sharp metallic tang of coal oil. It was the scent of vice and commerce blended into a singular, oppressive olfactory footprint that defined the nightlife of Tascosa. The noise was equally dense, a wall of sound composed of the frantic, tinny notes of a piano, the clatter of poker chips, and the low, constant rumble of masculine conversation. Ed King moved to the bar with the ease of a man who felt he owned the space he occupied. He did not scan the room with the frantic paranoia of a hunted man. Instead, he surveyed it with the casual disdain of a predator entering a grazing ground. He unbuttoned his heavy coat, revealing the dark vest and the white shirt underneath, which was already beginning to absorb the ambient humidity of the room. He leaned his left elbow on the polished mahogany of the bar top, his right hand resting casually near his hip, not on the gun, but close enough to signal readiness. He ordered whiskey for the group, his voice cutting through the din with a clear, authoritative timbre. The barkeep, a man with a face etched by years of witnessing violence, poured the amber liquid into 4 heavy glass tumblers without making eye contact. He knew the volatile chemistry that had just been introduced to the room. Frank Valley stood to King's right, his back to the bar, his eyes working the room. He was less relaxed than King. His gaze darted from table to table, assessing the threat level of every man present. He noted the position of Lem Woodruff, who was seated at a Monte table near the rear wall. Woodruff did not look up as the regulators entered, a deliberate act of feigned indifference that Valley recognized immediately as a tactical posture. The Catfish Kid was also present, leaning against a support pillar, whittling a piece of kindling with a large Bowie knife. The rhythmic scraping of the blade against the wood was lost in the noise, but the visual was a clear promise of violence. Valley took his drink but did not raise it immediately, his hand gripping the glass tightly as if he could crush it. Fred Chilton and John Lang took up positions flanking the others, creating a defensive perimeter around their leader. Lang was particularly uneasy. He felt the weight of the hostile stares that were now directed at them. The conversation in the immediate vicinity of the bar had died down, replaced by a tense silence that radiated outward like ripples in a pond. Men at far tables continued to talk, but their voices were pitched lower. their eyes flicking toward the LS men every few seconds. Lang sipped his whiskey, the harsh spirit burning his throat, but it did nothing to settle the knot of anxiety in his stomach. He knew they were outnumbered 10-1 in this room. If the shooting started here amidst the tables and the innocent bystanders, it would be a massacre. The dynamic of the room shifted subtly when a woman detached herself from a group near the piano and began to make her way toward the bar. This was the element that would dismantle the regulators' formation. She was known in the district, a woman who navigated the dangerous social currents of Hogtown with a practiced skill. Her dress was a bright, garish satin that caught the light of the lamps, standing out against the drab browns and grays of the cowboys' clothing. She moved with a deliberate slowness, her hips swaying in a rhythm that was calculated to draw the eye. This was not a random approach. It was a targeted maneuver. She was the lure, the siren song designed to exploit the one weakness in Ed King's armor: his vanity. King saw her approaching in the mirror behind the bar. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, softening the hard lines of his face. He turned to face her as she stopped a few feet away. She spoke to him in a voice that was low and intimate, pitched to be heard only by him, effectively cutting him off from his companions. The conversation was a dance of words, a mix of flirtation and challenge. She laid a hand on his arm, her fingers light on the rough wool of his coat. It was a gesture of familiarity that signaled to the room that King was engaged, distracted, and potentially vulnerable. The other men in the saloon watched this interaction with predatory intent. They knew that a man focused on a woman was a man who was not watching his back. Frank Valley shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the development. He leaned in close to King, whispering a warning. He urged King to stay focused, to keep the group tight. But King waved him off with a dismissive gesture. The whiskey and the attention of the woman had intoxicated him more than the alcohol ever could. He felt invincible. He believed that the system men were too cowed by his presence to try anything while he was looking them in the eye. He failed to understand that the attack would not come while he was looking. It would come when he stepped away. The woman whispered something into King's ear, then pulled back with a coy smile, gesturing toward the back door of the saloon. It was an invitation to privacy, a request to step away from the noise and the smoke for a moment of intimacy. To a rational observer, the trap was obvious. The back door led to the alley, the domain of shadows and refuse, a place where no witnesses would see a knife in the dark. But King was not thinking rationally. He was thinking with the arrogance of a man who had ridden down the main street of his enemy's stronghold without a scratch. He nodded to the woman, draining his glass in one long swallow. He turned to his men, telling them he would be back in a moment. Valley protested, his voice rising slightly in frustration. He grabbed King's sleeve, physically trying to restrain him. King shook him off, laughing. He told Valley to relax, that he could handle himself. He adjusted his hat and followed the woman as she turned and walked toward the rear of the building. The path she took wound through the tables, forcing King to navigate the crowded room, further separating him from the support of his regulators. As he walked, the men he passed fell silent, their eyes tracking his movement. It was a gauntlet, but King treated it like a parade. John Lang watched King go with a sinking feeling of dread. He saw the Catfish Kid stop whittling and slip the knife into his belt. He saw Lem Woodruff signal to a man across the room with a subtle nod. The pieces on the board were moving. Lang placed his hand on the butt of his revolver, his thumb resting on the hammer. He looked at Chilton, who returned the look with a grim resignation. They were now 3 men at the bar, and their leader was walking willingly into the darkness. The cohesion of the LS unit had been broken. The woman reached the back door and pushed it open. The cool night air rushed in, momentarily cutting through the heat of the saloon. She stepped out, and King followed her without hesitation. The door swung shut behind them, eclipsing them from view. The moment the latch clicked, the atmosphere in the saloon changed instantly. The tension that had been a static charge became kinetic. Woodruff stood up from his table, leaving his money and his cards. He moved toward the side exit, his movements efficient and purposeful. Other men, associates of the system, began to drift toward the exits, clearing the line of fire. Valley slammed his glass down on the bar, the sound sharp like a pistol shot. He cursed under his breath, a stream of profanity directed at King's foolishness. He debated following them immediately, but to do so would be to show weakness, to admit that they were afraid. He was trapped by the code of bravado that governed their lives. He had to wait. He had to give King a few minutes. Those few minutes would be the longest of his life. He turned his back to the bar, facing the room fully now, challenging anyone to make a move. His hand hovered over his gun, his fingers twitching. Outside in the alley behind the saloon, the reality was starkly different from the warm, noisy interior. The air was cold and still. The moonlight did not reach down into the narrow space between the buildings, leaving it in deep shadow. The ground was cluttered with empty crates, broken bottles, and piles of discarded lumber. It was an obstacle course of debris. King stepped out, his eyes adjusting slowly to the darkness. The woman was there, waiting for him near the corner of the building. But she was no longer smiling. Her posture was stiff, her eyes wide. She had done her part. She had delivered the target. Now she wanted to be gone before the hammer fell. King moved toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached out to take her hand, but she pulled away, retreating into the deeper shadows. It was then that the hairs on the back of King's neck stood up. The biological alarm system, honed by years of survival, finally pierced through the fog of arrogance. He stopped. He listened. He heard the faint rustle of fabric against adobe. He heard the intake of breath that was not his own. He realized in that split second that he was not alone with the woman. The conspirators had positioned themselves with chilling precision. They were not seeking a fair fight. They were executing a military maneuver. They had used the layout of the town against the regulators. By drawing King out the back, they had nullified the firepower of the three men at the bar. They had isolated the head of the snake. Hidden behind a stack of wood was a gunman, his weapon already leveled, resting on a log for stability. Another man was crouched behind a rain barrel, his silhouette merging with the dark cylinder. They held their fire, waiting for King to step into the perfect kill zone, a patch of ground where he would have no cover and no avenue of escape. Back inside, the piano player had stopped mid-song, sensing the shift in the room. The silence was absolute now. Even the gamblers had paused their shuffling. Every ear was tuned to the back of the building. They were waiting for the sound that they all knew was coming. It was a collective holding of breath, a macabre anticipation. The bartender wiped a glass with a dirty rag, round and round, his eyes fixed on the back door. He knew he would be scrubbing blood off the floor before the sun rose. Frank Valley could stand it no longer. He signaled to Chilton and Lang they were going in, or rather they were going out. They pushed away from the bar, abandoning their drinks. They moved toward the back door, their spurs jingling softly. But they were too late. The sequence of events had already been set in motion. The trap had been sprung the moment King stepped across the threshold. The distance between the bar and the back door was only 30 feet, but it might as well have been 30 miles. Time seemed to dilate, stretching out the seconds. King, standing in the alley, turned away from the woman. He looked toward the darkness where the woodpile stood. He saw the glint of metal, the moonlight catching the barrel of a rifle. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to shout a warning to his men, or perhaps to utter a curse. His hand dropped to his gun, his thumb finding the hammer. It was a reflex, fast and fluid, but the physics of the situation were absolute. Action is always faster than reaction. The men in the dark were already aimed. King was still reacting. The woman scrambled away, her satin dress tearing on a rough board. She vanished into the night, her role in the history of Tascosa complete. She left Ed King standing alone in the alley, a silhouette against the adobe wall. The wind picked up again, blowing a tumbleweed down the alley, the scratching sound loud in the silence. King stood his ground. He did not run. He faced the darkness, finally understanding the true nature of the night. He had been lured by a siren song, not of love, but of death. The saloon with its lights and music was a distant memory. Here there was only the cold, the dark, and the waiting muzzle. The environment of the alley was a tactical nightmare. The walls were high and smooth, offering no handholds. The ground was uneven. The only exit was the way he had come, back through the door or down the long, narrow throat of the alley, which was surely covered by more guns. King was boxed in. The chess match was over. The board had been flipped. The strategic error of separating from his unit was now presenting its bill. And the cost was total. Inside, Lang reached the midpoint of the room. He saw the expression on the faces of the system men. It was a look of grim satisfaction. They knew what was happening outside. They had won the first round without firing a shot. They had used the oldest trick in the book, and the most famous gunman in the Panhandle had fallen for it. Lang felt a surge of anger, directed not just at the enemy, but at King. How could he be so blind? But the anger was secondary to the urgency. He had to get to that door. The air in the saloon seemed to vibrate. The pressure was physical. It was the compression of the atmosphere before an explosion. The patrons pressed themselves against the walls, getting as low as possible. They knew that once the first shot was fired, the bullets would fly without discrimination. The thin wood of the tables offered no protection against the heavy slugs of the 45s. The only safety was the floor. Ed King, in his final moment of clarity, drew his pistol. The metal cleared leather. He brought the weapon up, leveling it at the woodpile. He was defiant to the end. He would not die with his gun in his holster. He would meet the Reaper armed. The scene was frozen in a tableau of imminent violence. The woman fleeing, the gunman hidden, the victim standing tall, and the regulators rushing to the rescue too late. The siren song had ended, and the percussion of war was about to begin. The date, March 21st, 1886, would be etched into the history of the West, not for the cattle prices or the weather, but for this specific sequence of betrayal and ambush. The decisions made in these few minutes, to enter the saloon, to listen to the woman, to step into the alley, were the tumblers of a lock clicking into place. The door to hell was unlocking. The lure had worked perfectly. The separation was achieved. The executioner was ready. As Valley's hand touched the latch of the back door from the inside, the silence of the night was shattered. It wasn't a gradual build-up. It was an instantaneous transition from quiet to chaos. But that first sound, the roar that would signal the end of Ed King, was the culmination of the siren's work. She had done what the LS enemies had failed to do for years. She had put Ed King in a box he couldn't shoot his way out of. The allure of the night, the promise of the woman, and the hubris of the gunman had combined to create a fatal intersection of circumstances. The narrative of the night had shifted from tension to kinetic action. The waiting was done. The regulators were split, their leader isolated and targeted. The system men had seized the initiative. The alleyway, usually a place of refuse, was now the center of the universe for everyone in Tascosa. The darkness held its breath for one final fraction of a second. Then the hammer fell. The wooden door of the Jenkins saloon clicked shut, severing the visual connection between Ed King and the sanctuary of the lit barroom. He stood now in the alleyway, a narrow corridor of compressed earth flanked by the rough texture of adobe walls. The temperature difference was immediate. The heat of the crowded interior was replaced by the biting chill of the high plains night. King took a step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel and debris that littered the ground. The woman who had guided him here moved to his right, her satin dress rustling softly against the dry weeds. She did not speak. Her role as the lure was concluded, and her survival instinct now dictated that she create distance between herself and the man she had just delivered to the slaughter. She stepped into the deeper recess of a doorway, pressing her back against the mud bricks, effectively removing herself from the line of fire. King stopped. The silence of the alley was deceptive, a heavy blanket that failed to mask the presence of others. His eyes, pupil-dilated from the dim light of the saloon, struggled to adjust to the profound darkness of the exterior. The moon provided scant illumination here, blocked by the height of the buildings. However, the biological alarm bells that had kept him alive through years of frontier violence began to ring. He sensed the displacement of air, the subtle shift of weight on wood, the metallic friction of a lever being worked. He turned his head toward the woodpile stacked against the rear of the neighboring building, a chaotic heap of lumber that offered perfect concealment for a crouching man. Hidden within that woodpile, Lem Woodruff leveled his rifle. The weapon was a Winchester Model 1873, a repeating rifle chambered in .44-40 caliber. Woodruff had prepared for this moment with cold calculation. He had rested the barrel of the rifle between two logs, creating a stable firing platform that eliminated the tremors of adrenaline. He looked down the iron sights, aligning the front post with the dark silhouette of Ed King. The distance was negligible, perhaps 10 or 15 feet. At this range, ballistics were simplified to point-and-shoot geometry. There was no need to account for windage or bullet drop. Woodruff's finger tightened on the trigger, taking up the slack in the mechanism. Simultaneously, the Catfish Kid, positioned near the corner of the building, raised his own weapon. The conspiracy was not leaving this to chance. They were ensuring a crossfire that would guarantee lethality. King, realizing the trap in the final fraction of a second, reached for his Colt revolver. His hand moved with the practiced speed of a professional gunman, his thumb seeking the hammer as his fingers wrapped around the grip. He was fast, perhaps the fastest man in the panhandle, but the laws of physics rendered his speed irrelevant. The ambushers were already aimed and ready. King was starting from zero. Woodruff squeezed the trigger. The hammer of the Winchester fell, striking the primer of the cartridge. The chemical propellant inside the brass casing ignited instantly, expanding with tremendous pressure. The .44 caliber projectile, a 200-grain slug of soft metal, was forced down the rifled barrel. It exited the muzzle at a velocity exceeding 1,200 feet per second. The muzzle flash was a blinding sphere of orange fire that momentarily illuminated the alley with the intensity of a lightning strike. The sound was a deafening crack, a high-velocity report that slammed into the adobe walls and reverberated through the narrow space. The projectile bridged the gap between the woodpile and Ed King in less than 1/100th of a second. It struck King in the neck just above the collar of his heavy coat. The impact was devastating. The soft metal of the slug deformed upon contact with the cervical tissue, expanding to transfer its kinetic energy into the target. It shattered the vertebrae, severing the connection between the brain and the body in an instant. The hydrostatic shockwave rippled through the surrounding flesh, destroying blood vessels and nerves. There was no pain, only the sudden, absolute cessation of motor control. King's body went limp. The neurological signals required to stand, to draw a weapon, or to speak were instantly cut. He did not stagger. He simply dropped. Gravity reclaimed him. He fell forward, his face slamming into the dirt of the alley. The Colt revolver, which he had just cleared from its holster, slipped from his nerveless fingers and landed in the dust beside him. The heavy wool coat, which he had worn as armor against the elements, now served as his shroud. Blood began to pump from the catastrophic wound, pooling rapidly in the loose soil, turning the dry earth into a dark, viscous mud. The Catfish Kid fired a split second after Woodruff. His shot went wild in the sudden flash and smoke, the bullet burying itself in the adobe wall of the saloon. It did not matter. The first shot had been the execution. The second was merely the punctuation mark on a sentence already written. The smoke from the black powder discharge filled the alley, a thick, sulphurous cloud that burned the eyes and throat. It hung in the still air, obscuring the body of the fallen regulator. Inside the saloon, the sound of the rifle shot was not a crack, but a heavy, muffled thud that shook the window panes. To the uninitiated, it might have sounded like a dropped keg or a slammed door. But to Frank Valley, Fred Chilton, and John Lang, the sound was unmistakable. It was the specific acoustic signature of high-caliber gunfire. The conversation at the bar died instantly. The piano player lifted his hands from the keys. The room froze. Valley's eyes widened, his mind instantly connecting the sound to King's departure. He slammed his whiskey glass down, the glass shattering on the bar top, the shards scattering, unnoticed. Back in the alley, Woodruff worked the lever of his Winchester, ejecting the spent casing. The brass shell spun through the air, catching the moonlight before landing in the dirt. He chambered a fresh round, the mechanical clack-clack of the action loud in the sudden silence that followed the gunshot. He did not rush forward to check the body. He knew what a .44 caliber slug did at that range. He stayed behind his cover, scanning the back door of the saloon. He knew that the shot would bring the others. The execution was the opening move. The ambush was the strategy for the counterattack. The woman, terrified by the violence she had facilitated, scrambled on her hands and knees away from the scene. She did not look back at the man she had lured to his death. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she rounded the corner of the building and vanished into the labyrinth of Hogtown. She was a ghost now, fleeing the haunting she had helped create. Her satin dress was stained. With the dust of the alley, the glamour of the evening stripped away to reveal the gritty reality of survival. Ed King lay motionless. The dust settled on his coat. The wind moved the brim of his hat slightly, a cruel mimicry of life. He was dead before he hit the ground. The reputation he had built, the fear he had instilled in the rustlers, the authority of the LS brand, all of it had been extinguished by a single piece of metal weighing less than an ounce. The suddenness of it was the most shocking element. One moment he was a living, breathing force of nature. The next he was an object, a pile of biology rapidly cooling in the night air. The blood flow from the neck wound was profuse. The carotid artery had been compromised. The heart, still beating for a few final seconds due to residual electrical impulses, pumped the remaining blood volume out onto the ground. The stain widened, soaking into the dry Texas earth. This was the literal cost of the range war. It was not paid in legal briefs or cattle counts. It was paid in gallons of vital fluid spilled in dirty alleyways. The sensory environment of the alley had been transformed. The smell of the horse manure and refuse was now overpowered by the acrid stench of burnt gunpowder and the copper scent of fresh blood. The ringing in the ears of the shooters was intense, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the distant sounds of the town. Woodruff shook his head, clearing the auditory static. He signaled to the Catfish Kid. They held their positions. They were now the hunters waiting for the prey to emerge from the den. Inside the saloon, the paralysis broke. Frank Valley roared a curse and drew his pistol. He did not hesitate. He did not formulate a complex plan. He simply reacted to the murder of his friend with a primal need for retribution. Chilton and Lang were a fraction of a second behind him. They turned from the bar, their coats sweeping back as they reached for their weapons. The other patrons in the saloon dove for cover, overturning tables and chairs in a desperate scramble to get out of the line of fire. They knew the LS men were about to storm the alley, and they knew that bullets would be coming back through that door. The geography of the killing floor was precise. The alley was approximately 10 feet wide. The back door of the saloon opened outward. To exit, the regulators would have to push the door open, stepping into the fatal funnel where King had just died. Woodruff and the system men knew this. They had their rifles trained on the wooden planks of the door. It was a classic fatal funnel. The moment the door opened, anyone standing in the frame would be illuminated by the light from the saloon, creating a perfect silhouette target for the men in the dark. Ed King's body acted as a grim obstacle. He lay directly in the path, his legs twisted, one arm outflung. Anyone exiting the saloon would have to step over or around him, forcing them to look down momentarily, distracting them from the threat ahead. It was a psychological hazard as much as a physical one. To see their leader dead in the dirt would send a shock of grief and rage through the regulators, potentially clouding their judgment. This was part of the calculation. The ballistic trauma to King was catastrophic. The entry wound was small, a dark puncture in the skin. The exit wound, had the bullet passed through, would have been massive. However, the spine had absorbed the energy, stopping the projectile. The slug remained lodged in the vertebrae, a permanent evidence of the crime. The force of the impact had snapped the head back violently before the body crumpled. It was a clinical, brutal, and efficient termination of a human life. There was no romance in it, no final words, no heroic last stand. It was simply physics applied to biology with lethal intent. The distance between the shooters and the victim highlighted the personal nature of the killing. This was not a sniper taking a shot from a rooftop 300 yards away. This was a man looking another man in the face from across a room-sized distance and pulling the trigger. Woodruff could see the surprise in King's eyes in the moment before the muzzle flashed. He could see the recognition. It was an intimate act of violence born of deep-seated hatred and years of conflict. As the seconds ticked by, the reality of the situation solidified. Ed King was not getting up. The LS regulators were now a trio. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably. The system had struck the first blow, and it was a decapitation strike. They had removed the tactical commander of the enemy force. Now they waited to see if the remaining regulators would be foolish enough to come out and die, or if they would hole up inside the saloon. The sound of the shot had rippled out into the town. In the upper town, Sheriff Jim East stopped his patrol. He cocked his head, listening. He knew that sound. It was not the celebratory fire of a cowboy blowing off steam. It was the flat, ugly sound of a killing. He turned his horse toward Hogtown, spurring the animal into a gallop. But he was too far away. The events in the alley would be decided long before the law could arrive. The darkness in the alley seemed to deepen as the smoke dissipated. The shadows returned, wrapping around the shooters. They adjusted their grips on their rifles, their knuckles white. They controlled their breathing, forcing their heart rates down. This was the discipline of the gunmen. To kill and then to wait, to remain still while the adrenaline screamed for movement. Woodruff rested his cheek against the stock of the Winchester, his eye fixed on the door latch. Inside, John Lang felt a cold dread wash over him. He knew King was dead. He didn't need to see the body. The single shot, the silence that followed it, spoke volumes. He looked at Valley and Chilton. They were preparing to rush out. Lang knew it was suicide to go out that door, but he also knew they had no choice. They could not leave King out there. The code of the West, the bond of the regulator, demanded that they recover their own, alive or dead. The barkeep at Jenkins' saloon ducked behind the heavy mahogany bar. He reached for a sawed-off shotgun kept on a shelf below the cash box. He didn't intend to join the fight, but he intended to protect his property. He listened to the boots thundering toward the back door. He whispered a prayer, or perhaps a curse, knowing that his establishment was about to become a slaughterhouse. Ed King's hat lay upside down in the dirt, a few feet from his head. The white silk lining was visible in the moonlight, a stark contrast to the filth of the alley. It was a small detail, but it emphasized the tragedy of the fall. The finery, the arrogance, the wealth, all of it ended here in the garbage and the mud. The wind blew a scrap of paper against the hat, tapping it gently. The physiological reaction of the shooters was beginning to manifest. The combat shakes were setting in. Woodruff's hands trembled slightly, a natural reaction to the massive dump of catecholamines into his bloodstream. He clenched his fists, forcing the muscles to obey. He could not afford to shake now. The second act was about to begin. He needed to be as steady as a rock when that door opened. The specific caliber, .44-40, was chosen for a reason. It was heavy enough to put a man down, but light enough to carry in quantity. The flat-nosed bullet was designed for tubular magazines safe from accidental detonation. It was a tool of the trade, as common as a hammer to a carpenter. But tonight, it was the instrument of history. It had rewritten the power dynamic of the Texas Panhandle in a fraction of a second. The stillness of the body was absolute. There was no rising and falling of the chest, no twitching of the fingers. The transition from subject to object was complete. Ed King was no longer a man. He was a tactical problem for his friends and a trophy for his enemies. The alleyway was his mausoleum, the adobe walls his tomb. As Frank Valley reached the door, he didn't bother with the latch. He kicked the wood with the sole of his boot, a violent driving strike intended to fling the barrier wide open. He wanted to clear the fatal funnel as quickly as possible. He wanted to bring his gun to bear on the darkness. He was screaming something, a wordless roar of fury that preceded him into the night. The door swung outward, the hinges screaming. The light from the saloon poured into the alley in a rectangular beam. It illuminated the boots of Ed King. It illuminated the blood, and it illuminated the empty space where the shooters had been standing. But they had moved. They had anticipated the light. They were deep in the shadows, their sights adjusted, their fingers tightening on the triggers once more. The execution of Ed King was over. The assassination was a success, but the war that it triggered was only just taking its first breath. The silence that had held the alley for those few long seconds was shattered as the regulators charged into the kill zone. The trap was sprung, the bait was taken, and the mechanism of death began to grind forward with unstoppable momentum. They fanned out slightly, trying to get off the fatal center line of the doorway, but the narrowness of the alley and the debris on the ground limited their movement. Lang fired his first shot. He felt the heavy hammer fall, the explosion in his hand, and the smell of his own gunpowder mixing with the ambient stench of the fight. He did not know if he hit anything. The darkness was a solid wall, impenetrable to his vision but permeable to the heavy slugs coming from the enemy. He saw another flash from the corner of a building further down the alley. A second gunman. They were caught in a crossfire. The tactical situation was catastrophic. They were exposed, illuminated, and firing pistols against rifles that were dug into cover. The realization hit Lang that their pistols were insufficient for this fight. The Winchester rifles, with their longer range and greater stability, were still in the scabbards on their horses out front, but there was no way to get to them. To retreat back through the saloon would be to turn their backs on the enemy, and to run around the block would take too long. They were committed to the fight with the weapons they carried. They had to close the distance or suppress the enemy fire with volume. Lang crouched low, trying to make himself a smaller target. He moved toward a stack of empty crates near the wall, seeking any form of cover. The ground was uneven, treacherous, with loose stones and garbage. His boot slipped on a piece of refuse, but he caught his balance, keeping his gun trained down the alley. He fired again, aiming low, hoping to skip around into the woodpile or hit a leg. The return fire was relentless. The enemy was not conserving ammunition. They were pouring fire into the doorway, trying to pin the regulators down or cut them to pieces. The noise was overwhelming. The reports of the heavy-caliber weapons bouncing off the hard adobe walls created a cacophony that made communication impossible. Lang could see Valley's mouth moving, shouting orders or insults, but the sound was lost in the roar of the gunfight. They were operating on instinct and training now. A unit of 3 trying to function as a single organism of retaliation. The sight of King's body lying there in the dirt served as a grim anchor for their resolve. They would not leave him. They would not run. The blood on the ground demanded a payment in kind. Fred Chilton moved to the opposite side of the doorframe, using the adobe wall as a shield. He fired methodically, taking an extra fraction of a second to aim, trying to pick his shots. He was the steady hand in the chaos. Lang watched him, drawing strength from his calmness. If Chilton wasn't panicking, then Lang wouldn't either. They were in hell, but they were in it together. The enemy hidden in the dark seemed to be everywhere. Every shadow held a potential gunman. The flashes of their rifles were the only points of reference in the void. A bullet struck a rain barrel near Lang, puncturing the wood. Water jetted out in a dark stream, mixing with the dust on the ground. The reality of the ballistics was terrifying. These were heavy, slow-moving projectiles that crushed bone and tore massive wound channels. There was no grace in being hit by a 44-40 slug. It was brute force trauma. Lang felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead beneath the brim of his hat. It wasn't fear of death exactly. It was a hyper-awareness of his own fragility. The decision to engage had been made the moment they stepped over King's body. There was no going back. The threshold had been crossed, both physically and metaphorically. To retreat now would be to admit defeat, to cede the town to the system, to dishonor the memory of the man lying at their feet. The adrenaline coursing through Lang's veins turned his fear into a cold, hard focus. He stopped firing for a moment, conserving his ammunition. He had 5 shots left in the cylinder. He needed to make them count. He peered into the darkness, looking for the source of the shots. He saw the faint outline of the woodpile, a jagged shape against the slightly lighter sky. He saw the movement of a hat brim. He raised his pistol, extending his arm fully. He took a breath, holding it to steady his hand. He squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked. He heard a shout from the darkness, a cry of pain or surprise. He had hit something. The satisfaction was grim and fleeting. Frank Valley was advancing. He had moved away from the safety of the wall and was pushing into the alley, firing as he went. It was a suicidal maneuver, born of pure rage. Valley was screaming at them to come out and fight like men. He was a force of nature, disregarding the bullets that kicked up dust around his boots. Lang knew he had to support Valley. He couldn't let his friend go into the dark alone. He pushed off from the crates, moving forward, his boots heavy in the mud. The environment of the alley was a character in the fight. The narrowness compressed the action, forcing the combatants into close proximity. The walls trapped the smoke, which began to fill the space, adding a choking, sulphurous fog to the darkness. The visibility dropped even further. Lang blinked, his eyes stinging. He could taste the gunpowder on his tongue, a metallic, bitter residue. They were 3 men against an unknown number, armed with pistols against rifles, standing in the light against men in the dark. The odds were impossible, but the logic of the frontier did not always follow the odds. It followed the will of the men involved, and the will of the LS regulators was ironclad. They had come to Tascosa to assert their dominance, and they would not be driven out by an ambush. Lang glanced down at King one last time as he moved past the body. The dead man seemed smaller now, diminished by the violence swirling around him. The execution was over, the battle had begun. Lang felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching himself from above. He saw the three of them, small figures in long coats, walking into the maw of the alley. He saw the flashes of the enemy guns. He saw the geometry of the crossfire. The realization that they needed to change the dynamic of the fight took hold. They couldn't win a standing gunfight in the open. They needed to root the enemy out. They needed to get close. The pistols were short-range weapons. To use them effectively, they had to close the gap to within 10 or 15 yards. This meant traversing the ground that the system men had zeroed in on. It was a gauntlet of death. Chilton shouted something to Lang, pointing toward the side of the alley where a gap between two buildings offered a potential flank. Lang nodded, understanding the intent. If they could split up, they could divide the enemy's fire. It was a basic tactical maneuver executed under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Lang shifted his vector, moving toward the shadows on the left. The firing from the woodpile intensified. The ambushers realized the regulators were not retreating. They redoubled their efforts to put them down. The air was filled with the hum of angry hornets as bullets cut through the space where Lang had been standing a second before. He threw himself behind a pile of lumber, the rough wood scraping his hand. He checked his cylinder. 4 rounds left. He reached into his coat pocket, his fingers fumbling for loose cartridges. He needed to reload. To be empty in this fight was a death sentence. The sheer volume of fire was staggering. It wasn't just 1 or 2 men. The system had brought a squad. Lang realized that this was not a spur-of-the-moment killing. It was a planned extermination. They intended to wipe out the entire LS leadership in one night. The thought hardened his resolve. If he was going to die tonight, he would take as many of them with him as he could. He snapped the loading gate of his Colt open, ejecting the spent casings. They fell into the mud, lost forever. He pushed fresh cartridges into the chambers, his hands moving with a tremor that he couldn't control. He snapped the gate shut. He was ready. He looked up at the night sky, a sliver of stars visible between the roofs of the adobes. It was a beautiful night to die, but John Lang did not intend to die. He intended to fight. He rose from his crouch, bringing his weapon up. He located the muzzle, flash of the nearest rifleman. He focused his entire being on that point of light. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, mechanical precision. He stepped out from the lumber, exposing himself to the fire once more. He began to walk toward the enemy, his gun extending before him like a finger of judgment. The blood of Ed King called for blood in return, and John Lang was the collection agent. The alleyway behind the Jenkins Saloon had transformed from a thoroughfare of refuse into a corridor of high-velocity kinetic energy. The darkness, which had previously been a passive element of the environment, was now punctured rhythmically by the muzzle flashes of heavy-caliber weapons. To the 3 regulators standing near the rear exit of the saloon, the night appeared to be disintegrating into a series of strobing orange lights, each one accompanied by the deafening report of black powder ignition. The tactical situation was stark and unforgiving. Frank Valley, Fred Chilton, and John Lang were positioned in the fatal funnel of the doorway, their silhouettes backlit by the yellow glow of the lamps from the interior. They were perfect targets, illuminated for the gunmen hidden in the deep shadows of the woodpiles and storage sheds that lined the narrow passage. Lem Woodruff, crouched behind the stack of lumber that had served as his sniper's nest, worked the lever of his Winchester with a mechanical rhythm. He did not fire wildly. He was a man of the range, accustomed to making ammunition count, but the targets presented to him were too inviting to ignore. He sighted on the shape of Frank Valley, who had moved furthest into the alley. Woodruff squeezed the trigger and the rifle bucked against his shoulder. The bullet, a .44 caliber slug, tore through the air, missing Valley by inches and striking the adobe wall of the saloon. The impact blew a crater in the dried mud brick, showering the regulators with dust and fragments of straw. The sound of the bullet striking the wall was a sharp, distinct slap that cut through the ringing in their ears. Frank Valley did not flinch. Instead, he advanced. He moved with a reckless aggression that defied the logic of self-preservation. He fired his Colt revolver at the spot where he had seen Woodruff's muzzle flash. The heavy pistol roared, the flame from the barrel extending 2 feet into the darkness. Valley was not aiming at a man. He was aiming at a location, hoping to suppress the fire that was pouring into the doorway. He walked directly over the body of Ed King, his boots finding purchase in the blood-slicked mud. He did not look down. His focus was entirely on the threat ahead. He screamed a challenge into the night, a raw vocalization of fury intended to draw the enemy's fire away from his companions. Fred Chilton moved to the left, stepping out of the direct line of the door. He pressed himself against the rough exterior of the saloon, using the darkness of the wall for concealment. He held his pistol with both hands, trying to steady his aim against the adrenaline tremors that racked his body. He saw movement near a rain barrel 20 yards down the alley. It was the Catfish Kid shifting position. Chilton fired. The bullet struck the iron hoop of the barrel, creating a spark that briefly illuminated the wood. The kid ducked, scrambling behind a pile of crates. Chilton fired again, the hammer of his Colt falling with a heavy mechanical clack. John Lang, realizing that staying near the door was a death sentence, broke to the right. He scrambled over a discarded shipping crate, his coat snagging on a loose nail. He ripped it free, ignoring the tearing fabric. He needed to find an angle. The system men were dug in, their positions fortified by the clutter of the alley. The regulators were exposed. Lang dropped to a knee behind a low mound of earth, leveling his pistol. He could see the muzzle flashes from 3 distinct locations now. Woodruff was at the woodpile, the Catfish Kid was near the barrels, and a third man, likely Charlie Emery or Louis Boosman, was firing from the corner of an adobe shack further back. The volume of fire increased. The air in the alley became saturated with smoke. The lack of wind meant the sulphurous cloud hung low, obscuring vision and burning the throat. The combatants were firing through a gray fog, aiming at flashes and sounds rather than visible targets. The noise was continuous, a rolling thunder of detonations that merged into a single, overwhelming roar. Within the saloon, the patrons huddled on the floor, listening to the war being waged just inches through the adobe walls. Bullets that missed the regulators struck the building, some embedding in the thick mud, others smashing through the wooden window frames, sending glass spraying into the interior. Frank Valley reached the midpoint of the alley. He was now dangerously close to Woodruff's position. He had emptied his first cylinder. He crouched behind a dead horse that had been dragged into the alley earlier in the week and left to rot. The carcass offered grim but effective cover. Valley broke open his revolver, the empty brass casings tumbling into the dirt. He reached for his cartridge belt, his fingers moving with frantic speed. He shoved fresh rounds into the chambers, his eyes never leaving the woodpile. He could hear Woodruff shouting orders to the others, his voice ragged. The system men realized that the regulators were not retreating. The initial ambush had failed to kill the entire group, and now they were facing a counterattack from men who had nothing left to lose. Woodruff shifted his aim. He saw Lang's muzzle flash to the right. He swung the Winchester barrel and fired. The bullet struck the ground near Lang's knee, kicking up a spray of dirt and gravel. Lang felt the stinging impact of the debris but did not check for a wound. He returned fire, emptying his pistol at the woodpile. The heavy slugs smashed into the lumber, sending splinters flying. The ballistics of the fight were dictated by the environment. The adobe walls of the buildings were thick enough to stop pistol rounds, but the wooden structures, the outhouses, the sheds, the fences, offered little protection. Bullets punched through inch-thick planks with ease, carrying lethal energy to whatever lay behind. The combatants had to be mindful of this. Cover that looked solid could be permeable. The catfish kid, realizing his rain barrel was disintegrating under Chilton's fire, abandoned his position. He sprinted across the alley, heading for the deeper cover of a blacksmith shop that stood at the rear of the lot. As the catfish kid ran, he fired wildly over his shoulder. One of his bullets struck a cast-iron stove that had been dumped in the alley, producing a loud, bell-like clang that resonated oddly in the midst of the gunfire. Valley saw the movement and snapped a shot at the running figure. He missed, the bullet whistling past the kid's head. The kid dove through the open doorway of the blacksmith shop, rolling into the darkness of the interior. From this new vantage point, he had a protected line of sight down the alley. The fight had now evolved from a static ambush into a fluid skirmish. The regulators had successfully pushed out of the fatal funnel. They had taken ground, but they were still outnumbered and they were still outgunned. The Winchesters used by the system men had a higher capacity and greater accuracy than the Colts carried by the LS men. Woodruff knew this. He kept up a steady rate of fire, pinning Chilton against the saloon wall. Every time Chilton tried to move, a bullet slapped the adobe inches from his head. John Lang finished reloading. He assessed the situation. They needed to flush Woodruff out. The woodpile was the anchor of the enemy defense. If they could break Woodruff, the others might scatter. Lang shouted to Valley, his voice barely audible over the gunfire. He pointed to the left flank. He wanted Valley to provide covering fire while he moved up. Valley understood. He rose from behind the horse carcass and unleashed a rapid volley of shots at the woodpile. Under the cover of Valley's barrage, Lang sprinted forward. He kept his body low, moving in a crouch. He covered 10 yards in 3 seconds, sliding into the gap between two sheds. He was now parallel to Woodruff's position. He had flanked the sniper. Lang raised his pistol, intending to fire into the side of the woodpile. But Woodruff was experienced. He had anticipated the maneuver. He abandoned the woodpile before Lang could get a clear shot, retreating back toward the blacksmith shop where the catfish kid had taken refuge. The retreat of the system men was not a rout. It was a tactical withdrawal. They were moving to a more fortified position. The blacksmith shop and the adjacent adobe shack formed a small compound at the end of the alley. By falling back, they drew the regulators deeper into the trap. The alley narrowed as it approached these buildings, creating a new choke point. Woodruff joined the kid inside the structure, taking up a position at a window. He now had a clear field of fire down the length of the alley. Frank Valley saw the enemy retreating and mistook it for weakness. He surged forward again, leaving the cover of the horse. He walked down the center of the alley, reloading as he went. His blood was up. He was no longer thinking about tactics. He was thinking about revenge. He wanted to get his hands on the men who had killed King. He wanted to look them in the eye as he pulled the trigger. Chilton shouted for him to get down to take cover, but Valley ignored the warning. He was a man possessed. The silence that followed the retreat was brief and terrifying. The shooting stopped for a few seconds as both sides adjusted their positions. The smoke began to drift upward, revealing the carnage of the alley. The ground was littered with brass casings, broken glass, and splinters. The body of Ed King lay alone near the saloon door, a dark shape in the distance. The air smelled of burnt powder and wet earth. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the men and the distant barking of dogs in the upper town, roused by the noise of the battle. Then the firing resumed with renewed intensity. Woodruff, now secure in the adobe shack, opened up with his Winchester. The muzzle flashes from the window were bright and focused. The bullets snapped down the alley, forcing Valley to dive for the corner of a shed. The dust kicked up around him as the rounds impacted the ground. The system men had established a fortress. The regulators were now besieging a fortified position with handguns. Chilton moved up to join Lang. They were huddled behind the shed, checking their ammunition. They were burning through rounds at an alarming rate. A standard gun belt held 40 or 50 cartridges. In a sustained firefight, that supply could be exhausted in minutes. Lang counted his remaining rounds. He had fewer than 20 left. He looked at Chilton, who nodded grimly. They had to finish this soon, or they would be reduced to using their empty pistols as clubs. The physical toll of the fight was beginning to manifest. The constant noise had dulled their hearing, leaving them in a muffled auditory world where only the sharpest sounds penetrated. The smoke stung their eyes, causing them to water and blur their vision. Their hands were coated in black soot from the blowback of the revolvers. Lang noticed a tremor in his left hand, a physiological reaction to the massive adrenaline dump. He clenched his fist, forcing the muscles to stabilize. Across the alley in the adobe shack, the system men were also feeling the strain. The Catfish Kid was hyperactive, moving from window to door, firing his pistol at anything that moved. Woodruff remained calm, his movements economical. He was the anchor. He knew that as long as they held the shack, the LS men could not advance. He also knew that help might be coming. The gunfire would attract others from Hogtown, men loyal to the system who would flank the regulators. The alley itself seemed to have expanded in the minds of the combatants. What was physically a distance of 50 yards felt like miles of treacherous terrain. Every inch of ground had to be paid for with risk. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a hostile entity that concealed death. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows that played tricks on the eyes. A swaying weed looked like a man rising to shoot. A discarded boot looked like a crouching gunman. Frank Valley shouted to the men in the shack. He called them cowards. He called them murderers. He dared them to come out into the open. His voice was raw, cracking with strain. There was no answer from the shack, only the crack of a rifle. The bullet took a chip out of the shed corner near Valley's head. The message was clear. Words were useless here. Only ballistics carried weight. Lang peered around the corner of the shed. He could see the dark rectangle of the shack's window. He knew he couldn't hit a man inside from this distance with a pistol, not with any reliability. They needed to get closer. But the ground between the shed and the shack was open, a kill zone of bare dirt and gravel. To cross it would be suicide. They were stalemated. The regulators held the alley, but the system held the fortress at the end of it. Chilton spotted a movement on the roof of the shack. It was Louis Boozman trying to get a better angle. Boozman had climbed up the backside and was now inching toward the front. Chilton raised his pistol and fired. The bullet struck the adobe roofline, sending a cloud of dust into Boozman's face. Boozman scrambled back, disappearing from view. The verticality of the fight added another dimension of danger. Threat could come from above as well as ahead. The standoff in the alley was a microcosm of the larger war. The LS men represented the aggressive, encroaching force of the syndicates, pushing forward with superior attitude but inferior position. The system men represented the entrenched local resistance, dug in and using the land to their advantage. The alley was the disputed territory, a strip of worthless mud that had become the most important geography in the Panhandle. Valley turned to Lang. He formulated a plan. He would suppress the window with rapid fire. Under that cover, Lang and Chilton would rush the shack. It was a desperate plan, reliant on luck and the enemy's inaccuracy. But they had no other options. They couldn't stay in the alley all night. Eventually, the system reinforcements would arrive, or the sheriff would intervene. They needed to end it now. Lang agreed. He readied himself. He wiped the sweat from his palms on his coat. He checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 rounds. He needed them to be enough. He looked at the open ground. It looked impossibly wide. He took a deep breath, inhaling the smoke and the dust. He nodded to Valley. Valley stepped out from the shed, exposing himself fully. He began to fire, working the hammer of his revolver with blinding speed. Bang! 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 The shots were rhythmic, suppressive. Dust puffed around the window of the shack. Woodruff ducked back, unable to return. Fire! Lang and Chilton broke cover. They sprinted across the open ground, their boots pounding on the hard earth. They ran low, their bodies hunched over. They did not fire. They focused on speed. The distance closed rapidly. 20 yards, 10 yards. They could see the texture of the adobe bricks on the shack. They could hear the shouts of the men inside. The catfish kid leaned out of the door, trying to get a shot at the runners. Valley shifted his aim, firing his last round at the kid. The bullet missed, but it forced the kid back inside. Lang and Chilton reached the wall of the shack. They pressed themselves against the adobe, breathing hard. They were now in the blind spot of the enemy. They were inches away from the men who killed King. The alley battle had shifted phases again. It was no longer a long-range exchange. It was now a close-quarter siege. The regulators were at the gates. The system men were trapped inside. The distance had been reduced to the thickness of a wall. The intimacy of the violence was about to increase exponentially. Back at the saloon entrance, the silence of the alley entrance was heavy. The body of Ed King remained undisturbed, a silent witness to the carnage that had moved down the throat of the passage. The blood had stopped flowing, congealing in the cold night air. The first act of the tragedy was complete. The actors had moved on to the second stage. The alley, scarred by bullets and stained with blood, settled into a temporary, uneasy quiet as the focal point of the war shifted to the adobe shack at its terminus. The sounds of the fight had attracted attention throughout Hogtown. Men were grabbing weapons and heading toward the noise. The perimeter of the conflict was expanding, but for the men pressed against the adobe wall, the world was very small. It consisted only of the next few seconds, the next few feet, and the enemy on the other side of the wood. The ambush in the alley had failed to wipe them out, and now the survivors were knocking at the door. The confrontation at the rear of the Jenkins Saloon had distilled itself into a brutal siege, centered on a small, nondescript adobe structure. John Lang and Fred Chilton were pressed flat against the rough mud brick exterior of the shack, their chests heaving as they fought to recover the oxygen debt incurred during their sprint across the open ground. The air in the immediate vicinity was thick with the dust kicked up by their boots and the lingering smoke of the black powder discharges. They were now in the blind spot of the enemy, separated from the men who had killed Ed King by only the thickness of the earthen wall. This wall, constructed of sun-dried mud mixed with straw, was a formidable barrier against small arms fire, absorbing the kinetic energy of bullets without splintering or failing. It stood as a silent, impartial participant in the violence, sheltering the system men inside while denying the regulators a clear target. Inside the shack, the atmosphere was one of claustrophobic tension. Lem Woodruff and the catfish kid had secured the door and were now positioned at the single window in the cracks in the wood, waiting for the LS men to make a mistake. The interior was pitch black save for the intermittent flashes of their own weapons and the thin beams of moonlight that penetrated the gaps in the construction. The darkness gave them a tactical advantage. They could see out into the slightly illuminated alley, but the regulators could not see in. Woodruff, nursing a wound from the earlier exchange or perhaps just the accumulated bruises of the fight, kept his Winchester rifle trained on the approach. He knew the regulators were outside. He could hear their heavy breathing and the scuffling of their boots on the gravel. Frank Valley, having provided the suppressive fire that allowed his companions to reach the wall, now made his own move. He did not replicate their stealth or their caution. He advanced with a singular, terrifying purpose. He holstered his empty revolver and drew a second weapon or reloaded on the move, his hands working with a feverish dexterity. Valley was a man consumed by the need for direct conflict. The death of King had stripped away his professional detachment, leaving only a raw, burning desire to inflict damage. He moved away from the cover of the shed and stepped into the open space that Lang and Chilton had just traversed. He did not run low. He walked with a predatory hunch, his eyes fixed on the dark rectangle of the shack's door. The geography of the siege was intimate. The shack was small, perhaps 10 by 12 feet, a confined box that forced the combatants into extreme proximity. The distance between the muzzle of a gun inside and the chest of a man outside was measured in inches. This closeness negated the need for long-range marksmanship and replaced it with point-blank ferocity. Valley reached the corner of the building where Lang and Chilton were huddled. He did not stop to confer with them. He rounded the corner, stepping directly in front of the door. It was an act of defiance that bordered on suicide. He shouted a challenge, his voice cracking with strain, demanding that the men inside come out and face him. Inside the shack, the sound of Valley's voice provided a precise auditory target. The catfish kid, crouching near the floor, shifted his position. He could sense the presence of the regulator just beyond the wood. The door of the shack was made of rough-hewn planks, sturdy enough to keep out the weather but offering negligible protection against a .45 caliber slug. Valley raised his pistol and fired blindly through the wood. The heavy bullet punched a clean hole through the plank, sending a shower of splinters into the dark interior. The muzzle flash illuminated the wood grain for a split second, a jagged scar in the night. The return fire was instantaneous. A rifle shot from within the shack blasted outward, the bullet tearing through the door, inches from Valley's hip. The sound of the detonation inside the small room was magnified, a booming concussion that rattled the dust from the ceiling. Valley did not flinch. He fired again and again, emptying his cylinder into the door. He was trying to turn the wooden barrier into a sieve, hoping that one of his rounds would find flesh in the darkness. The woodwork began to disintegrate under the barrage, holes appearing in a tight grouping near the latch. Lang and Chilton, realizing that Valley was exposing himself to lethal fire, tried to support him. They moved to the window, smashing the remaining glass with the barrels of their guns. They thrust their weapons into the interior, firing blindly into the corners of the room. The interior of the shack became a chaotic kill box filled with flying projectiles, ricochets, and the screams of men under extreme stress. The smoke from the black powder filled the room instantly, creating a choking, blinding fog that reduced visibility to zero. The system men were firing at the flashes, and the regulators were firing at the noise. Frank Valley, his pistol empty, stepped back to reload. His movements were jerky, his fine motor skills deteriorating under the massive adrenaline load. He fumbled with the cartridges, dropping one into the dirt. He cursed, a sharp expletive that cut through the ringing in his ears. He managed to shove fresh rounds into the loading gate, snapping the cylinder shut. He stepped back up to the door. He was not satisfied with shooting through the wood. He wanted to breach the room. He kicked the door, his boots striking the wood near the lock. The door shuddered but held. It was barred from the inside. The physical reality of the fight was brutal. The noise was physically painful, a constant assault on the eardrums that caused a dull, throbbing ache in the skull. The smell of the gunpowder was overwhelming, tasting of sulfur and charcoal. The dust in the air coated the throat, making it difficult to breathe. Sweat ran down Valley's face, stinging his eyes, mixing with the soot to form a dark grime. His hands were slick on the grips of his gun. Every sense was overloaded, focused entirely on the immediate threat. Inside the shack, Lem Woodruff was pressed into the corner away from the door. He had tracked Valley's movement by the sound of his boots and the location of his shots. He knew the regulator was standing directly in front of the entrance. Woodruff leveled his Winchester. He did not need to see the target, he simply needed to fire through the concealment. He aimed at chest height, calculating the angle. He waited for the pause in Valley's firing, the moment of silence that indicated a reload or a hesitation. Valley prepared to kick the door again. He shifted his weight to his back foot, preparing to drive his heel into the planks. In that moment of weight transfer, he was stationary. He presented a fixed target. Woodruff squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared in the confined space. The .44 caliber bullet, traveling at over 1,200 feet per second, struck the door. It punched through the wood effortlessly, carrying a cloud of splinters with it. The projectile exited the wood and crossed the short distance to Frank Valley. It struck him in the head, entering near the left eye. The impact was catastrophic. The heavy slug, slightly deformed from passing through the door, transferred all its kinetic energy into the skull. It shattered the orbital bone and plowed into the brain tissue. There was no time for pain, no time for realization. The neural pathways controlling balance, consciousness, and life were severed instantly. Frank Valley did not cry out. The shout of defiance that had been building in his throat was extinguished before it could be voiced. His body went limp, the tension in his muscles vanishing. He collapsed straight down, his legs folding beneath him. He hit the ground with a heavy, lifeless thud, landing in the dirt directly in front of the door he had tried so desperately to breach. His hat tumbled from his head, rolling a few feet away. His pistol fell from his hand, landing in the dust. John Lang, standing just a few feet away at the window, heard the specific sound of the impact. It was a wet, heavy noise, distinct from the dry crack of the gunfire. He turned his head and saw Valley crumple. The horror of the sight was absolute. Valley, the most vibrant and aggressive of them all, was now a heap of clothing in the dirt. Lang abandoned the window and rushed to his friend's side. He grabbed Valley's coat, pulling him away from the fatal doorway, dragging him toward the cover of the corner. Chilton covered the movement, firing a desperate volley into the door to keep the system men heads down. He did not know if he was hitting anything. He only knew he had to buy Lang time. The sound of Valley's body dragging over the gravel was a gritty, friction-filled noise that sickened Chilton. He saw the blood trail that Valley left behind, a dark smear on the dry earth. Lang pulled Valley behind the safety of the adobe wall. He rolled him over, looking for a sign of life. The wound was grievous. The left side of Valley's face was destroyed. The blood pumped rhythmically for a few seconds, then slowed, then stopped. The heart, deprived of instruction from the brain, ceased its function. Frank Valley was dead. The realization hit Lang with the force of a physical blow. They were now two. The balance of the fight had shifted dramatically. The regulators had lost their primary aggressor. The system men, realizing that the firing from the door had stopped, sensed their victory. They began to shout taunts from inside the shack. They called out, asking who was next. The psychological warfare resumed, bolstered by the successful kill. The morale of the men in the shack surged. They had withstood the assault and taken down another LS man. Lang and Chilton were now pinned against the wall of the shack, trapped in the very position they had fought to reach. They could not go forward into the room. The fatal funnel of the door was proven death. They could not retreat across the open ground. The system men would shoot them in the back from the window. They were in a tactical stalemate, but one where the clock was ticking against them. The bodies of their friends, King in the alley, Valley at their feet, were grim markers of their failing strategy. The environment around the shack seemed to close in. The darkness felt heavier, the cold more penetrating. The adrenaline that had fueled their charge began to fade, replaced by the cold, shaking reality of shock. Lang wiped his hand across his face, realizing too late that it was stained with Valley's blood. The metallic smell was nauseating. He looked at Chilton. Chilton's face was a mask of grim determination, but his eyes betrayed a deep fear. They were alone in the enemy's stronghold. The damage to the shack was extensive. The door was splintered and perforated, hanging loosely on its hinges. The window frame was smashed, the glass reduced to shards on the floor. Bullet pockmarks scarred the adobe walls where rounds had impacted and failed to penetrate. The structure had held, but it bore the scars of the siege. Inside, the dust was settling, coating the occupants in a fine gray powder. The weaponry of the night had proven its lethality. The Winchester rifles and Colt revolvers had done exactly what they were designed to do. They had converted chemical energy into mechanical destruction. The fragility of the human body against these machines was starkly evident. A man could be full of life and rage one second and inert matter the next. There was no romance in it, only the brutal arithmetic of ballistics. Lang checked his ammunition again. He was critically low. The intense exchange at the door had depleted his reserves. He had perhaps 10 rounds left between his gun and his belt. He knew Chilton was in a similar state. They could not sustain another high-intensity firefight. They needed to change tactics or find a way to withdraw. But withdrawing meant leaving the bodies, a violation of the code that bound them. The sound of the town began to intrude on their awareness. Voices were shouting in the distance. Dogs were barking. The gunfight had lasted only minutes, but it had woken the entire district. Reinforcements for the system could be arriving at any moment. The LS men were isolated deep in hostile territory, with no support coming from the ranch. The isolation was total. Valley's body lay cooling in the shadow of the shack. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass near the wall. It was an indifferent natural force, uncaring of the tragedy that had just unfolded. The dust from the alley began to settle on Valley's coat, beginning the process of burying him even before the fight was over. Lang reached out and closed Valley's remaining eye, a small gesture of respect in the midst of the carnage. The siege of the adobe had failed. The objective, to root out and kill the ambushers, had not been achieved. Instead, the regulators had paid a heavy price for their aggression. The initiative had passed back to the defenders. Woodruff and the Catfish Kid held the fort. They controlled the door and the window. They controlled the pace of the engagement. Lang looked at the door again. The holes in the wood stared back at him like dark eyes. He imagined the rifle barrel waiting on the other side, invisible in the darkness. He knew that if he stepped in front of that wood again, he would share Valley's fate. The geometry of the situation was absolute. The angle of fire from inside covered the entire approach. Chilton signaled to Lang. He pointed toward the corner of the building, back the way they had come. He was suggesting a retreat to the corner of the shed, where they could at least have some cover in a field of fire. That wasn't point blank. Lang nodded. It was a bitter pill to swallow, giving up the ground they had bled for, but staying here was suicide. They prepared to move. They would have to leave Valley. There was no way to drag him across the open ground without getting shot. They would come back for him later if they survived. If. The word hung heavy in Lang's mind. The certainty of survival had evaporated with the smoke of the last shot. As they moved, the Catfish Kid fired a blind shot through the window. The bullet struck the ground near Lang's foot, kicking up gravel. It was a reminder that they were being watched, that the enemy was still dangerous. Lang did not return fire. He saved his rounds. He scurried back to the corner of the shed, his heart pounding against his ribs. Chilton followed, diving into the cover just as another shot slapped the adobe wall. They were back in the alley proper now. The view was the same as before. The dark corridor, the refuse, the distant light of the saloon. But the context had changed. They were fewer now. The silence from the shack was mocking. The system men knew they had won this round. They didn't need to come out. They could just wait. The siege was over, broken by the death of the besieger. The adobe shack stood firm, a monument to the resilience of the system's defense. The regulators were battered, bloodied, and diminished. The night of March 21st dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity of tension. The fight was not over, but the hope of a quick victory was gone. Now it was a struggle for survival in a war zone where the enemy held all the cards. The mental image of Frank Valley falling would remain etched in Lang's mind forever. The suddenness of it, the lack of fanfare. One moment a warrior, the next a corpse. It was the ultimate lesson of the frontier. The gun made all men equal, and the bullet did not respect reputation or courage. It only respected the laws of physics, and in the doorway of that adobe shack, physics had been on the side of Lem Woodruff. The cold air seemed to bite deeper now. Lang shivered, not just from the temperature, but from the shock. He gripped his pistol tighter, the metal cold and hard in his hand. He looked at the moon, wondering if it would be the last thing he saw. The night was indifferent. It offered no answers, only shadows and the promise of more violence. The street had become a war zone, and the war was going badly. The retreat from the adobe shack to the relative cover of the storage shed corner left John Lang and Fred Chilton in a state of hyper-arousal. The sympathetic nervous systems of both men were operating at maximum output, flooding their bloodstreams with cortisol and adrenaline. This chemical cocktail, while essential for immediate survival, severely degraded high-level cognitive functions and fine motor skills. Their hands shook with a visible tremor that had nothing to do with the cold night air and everything to do with the biological shock of witnessing Frank Valley's execution. The auditory landscape of the alley was a confusing mix of ringing tinnitus, a direct result of the unshielded gunfire in enclosed spaces, and the muffled shouts of the system men who were now emboldened by their success. The smoke from the black powder cartridges had not dissipated. Instead, it had settled into the low ground of the alley, creating a localized fog that distorted light and shadow. From their position behind the shed, the regulators scanned the darkness with frantic intensity. Their visual processing was compromised by the tunnel vision effect of combat stress. They were looking for threats in a landscape that was entirely hostile. Every shape that did not conform to the geometry of a building was identified as a potential gunman. The wooden crates, the discarded rain barrels, and the piles of refuse took on the sinister aspect of human silhouettes. The psychological pressure was immense. They were two men against an unknown number, deep in enemy territory, with their escape route blocked by the kill zone of the alley they had just traversed. The tactical cohesion of the LS group had shattered. They were now reacting to stimuli rather than controlling the engagement. It was in this atmosphere of heightened paranoia and sensory distortion that the first tragedy of the new phase occurred. A few yards down the alley adjacent to the saloon stood a small restaurant and residence owned by Jesse Sheets. Sheets was a neutral party in the range war, a man who made his living feeding the cowboys rather than fighting them. However, the curiosity that often overrides self-preservation in the uninitiated drove him to investigate the commotion. He had been inside his establishment when the shooting started, listening to the roar of the battle behind his property. As the firing lulled following Valley's death, Sheets made the fatal error of assuming the violence had moved on or concluded. He opened the rear door of his building. The latch clicked loudly in the silence, a sound that cut through the ringing in Lang and Chilton's ears like a thunderclap. The door swung outward and Jesse Sheets stepped onto the threshold. He was not armed. He was likely looking for news or checking to see if his property had been damaged. However, he was backlit by the light from within his restaurant. To the eyes of John Lang and Fred Chilton crouched in the dark and watching for a flanking maneuver, Sheets was not a neighbor. He was a silhouette appearing suddenly on their flank. a dark shape emerging from a structure that could easily harbor enemy combatants. The reaction of the regulators was instantaneous and reflexive. There was no time to challenge the figure, no time to ask for identification. The rules of engagement had been rewritten by the ambush. Anything that moved was a threat. Chilton swung his weapon toward the new target. The mechanics of their response were faster than their conscious thought. They saw a man. They saw him stepping into the alley. He fired. A shot rang out. The muzzle flashes illuminated the shed corner, revealing the grimacing faces of the regulators. The bullet bridged the short distance to the doorway in milliseconds. The projectile struck Jesse Sheets in the face. The impact was immediate. Sheets did not stagger. He collapsed. The physics of the heavy caliber slug transferred massive energy into his head, knocking him backward into his own establishment or crumpling him onto the doorstep. He fell without a cry, a victim of the chaotic geometry of urban combat. The door released from his hand swung slowly in the wind, framing the body of the fallen man. For a second, Lang and Chilton believed they had neutralized a flanker. They kept their guns trained on the doorway, waiting for a second man to emerge. But no one came. There was no return fire from the restaurant. Slowly, the realization began to seep in. The posture of the fallen man, the lack of a weapon clattering to the ground, the domestic setting of the building, it all pointed to a catastrophic error. They had fired on a civilian. The sinking feeling in Lang's gut was heavier than the fear of death. It was the cold weight of guilt. In the confusion of the smoke and the dark, they had added an innocent man to the butcher's bill of the night. But the war did not pause for regret. The sound of their shots had given away their exact position. The system men, still secure in the adobe shack and the surrounding shadows, now knew exactly where the survivors were huddled. The strategic initiative remained firmly with the ambushers. Among the enemy was a rifleman who had separated himself from the main group. This individual, whose identity would remain a subject of debate in the lore of the West, but who was likely a professional hunter or a marksman of considerable skill, had moved while the regulators were distracted by the incident with Sheets. This sniper had climbed to a vantage point that offered a commanding view of the alley. It might have been a rooftop, a stack of hay bales, or a gap in a fence that provided a keyhole view of the shed corner. He was armed with a rifle, likely a Winchester or a Sharps, a weapon capable of precision that the handguns of the regulators could not match. He settled into his position, controlling his breathing, steadying the heavy barrel of his weapon. He was not firing rapidly. He was waiting for a target to present itself. He watched the corner of the shed where the muzzle flashes had originated, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Fred Chilton, unaware of the new angle of threat, shifted his position. He was anxious to move, to get away from the location where they had just fired. He knew that staying in one spot was a death sentence. He rose slightly from his crouch, intending to dash across the gap to a woodpile that offered better cover. It was a sound tactical decision in theory. Movement is life. But in this specific instance, it was fatal. As he straightened his legs, his upper body rose above the defilade of the shed's foundation. The sniper saw the movement. The dark shape of Chilton's coat detached itself from the shadow of the building. The moonlight, filtering through the drifting smoke, caught the metal of his badge or a button on his coat. It was enough. The rifleman adjusted his aim, tracking the lateral movement of the target. He applied the necessary hold for the short distance and squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot was a singular flat crack that sounded different from the booming roar of the pistols. It was the sound of high-velocity ballistics. The bullet struck Fred Chilton in the chest. The projectile entered the thoracic cavity, smashing through the ribcage. It caused massive hydrostatic shock to the lungs and the great vessels near the heart. The impact halted Chilton's forward momentum entirely. It was as if he had run into an invisible wall. The air was driven from his lungs in a sharp, involuntary exhalation. Chilton spun from the force of the blow, his boots scrabbling in the dirt for purchase that was no longer there. He fell heavily, landing on his side near Lang's feet. The suddenness of the violence was jarring. One moment Chilton was a tactical partner, a source of support and covering fire. The next, he was a casualty. Lang dropped to his knees beside his friend, ignoring the exposure. He grabbed Chilton by the lapels of his coat, pulling him back into the deeper shadow of the shed. "Fred," Lang hissed, his voice tight with panic. He looked at the wound. It was a dark puncture in the heavy wool, oozing blood that looked black in the moonlight. The exit wound, if there was one, would be on the other side, likely much larger. Chilton was gasping for air, his eyes wide with the realization of his mortality. He tried to speak, but blood bubbled past his lips. The lung had been perforated. He was drowning in his own fluids. The reality of their situation was now absolute. King was dead. Valley was dead. Sheets was dead or dying. And now Chilton was bleeding out in the dirt. John Lang was the last man standing. The isolation was a physical sensation, a cold void expanding in his chest. The system had systematically dismantled the LS force with ruthless efficiency. They had used the terrain, the darkness, and the regulators' own aggression against them. Chilton's hand fumbled at his belt. He was trying to draw his revolver. His fingers, slick with blood and losing coordination, struggled with the heavy weapon. He managed to pull it free from the leather. He pushed it toward Lang. The gesture was clear. He knew he was finished. He knew he would not need the gun again. But Lang might. Lang was low on ammunition. Chilton was offering his last asset to the survivor. "Take it," Chilton wheezed, the words barely audible. "Give 'em hell." Lang took the pistol. The metal was warm from Chilton's body heat. It felt heavy in his hand, a burden of responsibility as much as a weapon. He checked the cylinder. It was loaded. He now had 2 guns, a desperado's arsenal, but he had no army. He looked at Chilton's face. The light was fading from his eyes. The breathing grew shallow, ragged, and then stopped. Fred Chilton lay still, joining the silent ranks of the night's victims. Lang was alone. The silence that followed Chilton's death was heavy and oppressive. The firing from the system men had stopped again. They were waiting to see the result of their handiwork. They knew they had hit another one. They were counting the bodies, doing the math of attrition. Lang pressed his back against the rough wood of the shed. He could feel the grain of the planks through his coat. He tried to control his breathing, to slow the racing of his heart. He needed to think. The friendly fire incident with Sheets gnawed at his mind. It was a stain on the night, a mistake that stripped away any pretense of righteous enforcement. They were not lawmen dispensing justice. They were agents of chaos, spraying death into the dark. The system men, for all their ambush tactics, had been precise. They had killed the regulators. The regulators had killed a bystander. The moral high ground, if it ever existed, had been lost in the smoke. Lang checked the load in his own pistol. He had 3 rounds left. He checked Chilton's gun. 5 rounds. 8 shots. That was his entire future. 8 chances to save his life. He looked out at the alley. It was a graveyard. The bodies were landmarks now. King at the door. Valley at the shack. Chilton at the shed. Sheets at the restaurant. The path of the fight was marked in corpses. The sniper who had killed Chilton was still out there. Lang scanned the roof lines, the fence gaps, the wood piles. He saw nothing. The enemy was a ghost. To move was to die. To stay was to die. The dilemma was paralyzing. But Lang knew he couldn't stay behind the shed forever. The system men would eventually flank him. They would come with shotguns or torches. He had to move. He decided to move back toward the main street. It was a retreat, a full admission of defeat. He needed to get to a horse, to the sheriff, to anywhere but this alley. But the way back led past the body of Jesse Sheets and the open fatal funnel of the saloon rear door. It was a gauntlet. Lang began to crawl. He moved on his hands and knees, keeping his profile as low as possible. The ground was cold and hard, the gravel digging into his palms. He dragged the 2 pistols with him, keeping them out of the dirt. He moved inch by inch, listening for the sound of a hammer cocking, for the intake of breath. The sensory details of the crawl were vivid, the smell of the horse manure, the dampness of the soil, the rustle of his own clothing. As he passed the restaurant, he saw Sheets again. The man was still. The light from the open door cast a long yellow rectangle across the alley. Lang had to cross that light. It was the same trap that had killed King. He hesitated at the edge of the illumination. He could hear voices inside the restaurant now, people shouting, discovering the body. The confusion was growing. Lang took a breath and scrambled across the light. He moved fast, a crab-like scuttle. A shot rang out from the darkness. The sniper again. The bullet struck the ground inches from his hand, spraying dirt into his face. Lang didn't stop. He rolled into the shadow on the far side of the building, coming up against a rain barrel. He was safe for the moment. He had crossed the zone. He looked back at where Chilton lay. He couldn't see the body from here, but he knew it was there. He felt a surge of rage, hot and blinding. He wanted to go back. He wanted to stand up and empty both guns into the darkness. But the survival instinct was stronger. The lizard brain, the ancient part of the mind that demands life, overruled the emotions. He had to live to tell the story. He had to live to make them pay another day. The friendly fire incident had changed the dynamic of the town as well. The citizens of Tascosa, initially hiding from the fight between the factions, would now be outraged. An innocent man had been gunned down. The regulators had lost the support of the populace. They were now pariahs. Lang realized that even if he survived the night, Tascosa was closed to him. The LS brand was now synonymous with reckless murder. The firing from the system positions was sporadic now. They were conserving ammunition, or perhaps they were moving, closing the net. The Catfish Kid, Woodruff, the sniper. They were professional killers doing a job. They weren't rushing. They had all the time in the world. The night belonged to them. Lang wiped his eyes. His vision was blurry, his hands trembling. He looked at the guns in his hands. The bluing on the metal was scratched, the wood grips slick with sweat and grime. These were the tools of his trade, but tonight they had failed him. They hadn't protected King. They hadn't saved Valley. They hadn't saved Chilton. And they had killed Sheets. They were cursed objects. He checked the perimeter again. The shadows seemed to be lengthening. The moon was moving across the sky, changing the angles of visibility. What was hidden before might be revealed soon. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let them pin him down. The concept of friendly fire was a cruel euphemism. There was nothing friendly about it. It was negligent homicide born of fear. And the fatal error was not just the shooting of Sheets. It was the arrogance of coming to Hogtown in the first place. The wind picked up, swirling the smoke. For a moment the alley cleared. Lang saw the full extent of the battlefield. It was a small, dirty strip of land, insignificant in the vastness of the panhandle. But tonight, it was the center of the universe. It was a place where lives were weighed and found wanting. The tragedy was total. Lang holstered one gun and kept the other ready. He prepared to move to the next cover, a pile of lumber near the corner of the block. He was moving away from the fight, away from his friends. It felt like betrayal, but it was necessity. He left Fred Chilton in the dust, a silent guardian of the shed corner. The sniper waited, watching for the next mistake. And John Lang, the last regulator, crawled through the mud trying to find a way out of the hell they had created. The silence that descended upon the alleyway behind Jenkins' saloon in the early minutes of March 22nd, 1886, was not a true absence of sound, but a heavy ringing void left in the wake of acoustic trauma. The violent percussion of the gunfight had temporarily deafened the combatants, leaving them in a muffled world where their own heartbeats sounded like drum strikes against their ribs. In this auditory haze, the Catfish Kid, known legally as John Goff, executed the final maneuver of the engagement. He did not flee the scene as John Lang had done, nor did he succumb to wounds like Frank Valli or Fred Chilton. Instead, he integrated himself into the geography of the battlefield, becoming as inert and silent as the woodpile he had used for cover. The Catfish Kid pressed his body into the gap between the stacked logs and the rough adobe wall of the shed. His position was a masterpiece of accidental camouflage. The shadows in this corner of the alley were absolute, shielded from the moonlight by the overhang of the roof and the bulk of the timber. He curled his legs up tight to his chest, making himself small, reducing his silhouette to a nondescript lump that merged with the refuse of the yard. His breathing was shallow and controlled, a discipline born of necessity. He knew that the fight was technically over, but the danger had simply shifted forms. The LS regulators were dead or gone, but the law was coming. His weapon, a heavy caliber rifle, lay across his knees. The barrel was still hot to the touch, radiating a warmth that seeped through his trousers. He did not cycle the action to chamber a new round, fearing the mechanical clack-clack would give away his position to any lingering enemies or approaching deputies. He kept his finger outside the trigger guard, resting on the metal receiver. He was in a state of hyper-alertness, his eyes scanning the limited field of view available through the gaps in the wood. He could see the boots of the dead men, dark shapes in the dirt, but he did not focus on them. He watched the entrances to the alley, waiting for the inevitable arrival of Sheriff Jim East. Inside the adobe shack, Lem Woodruff lay in a pool of his own blood. The systemic shock of his wounds was beginning to set in. He had taken a bullet in the groin area, a devastating injury that combined massive blood loss with excruciating, debilitating pain. He did not cry out. He gripped a piece of firewood with a white-knuckled intensity, grinding his teeth to suppress the urge to scream. He knew that any noise could draw a finishing shot from a surviving regulator. Woodruff was a prisoner of his own broken body, trapped in the dark room that smelled of burnt powder and copper. He listened to the wind rattling the loose door planks, wondering if he would bleed to death before the doctor arrived. The Catfish Kid knew Woodruff was hit. He had heard the grunt of impact and the subsequent collapse, but the kid did not move to help. In the brutal calculus of the night, attempting to render aid would expose him to the open ground. He remained in his woodpile, a predator playing the role of a corpse. This was his gambit. He would wait until the area was secured by neutral or friendly forces before revealing himself. If the LS men returned, he would be an ambush of one. If the law arrived, he would surrender on his own terms. The first sign of the changing guard came from the upper town. The sound of galloping horses approached rapidly, the hooves striking the hard-packed earth of the main street with a frantic rhythm. The riders did not slow down as they passed the courthouse or the McMaster's store. They were heading straight for the sound of the war. Sheriff Jim East and his deputy Pierce pulled their mounts to a sliding halt in front of the Jenkins Saloon. The animals were lathered and wide-eyed, sensing the smell of blood that now permeated the district. East dismounted with his shotgun in hand, a double-barreled 10-gauge that commanded respect. East did not rush into the alley blindly. He was a veteran of the frontier, a man who had tracked Billy the Kid and understood the dynamics of an ambush. He moved to the corner of the building, peering into the darkness. He shouted a command, his voice booming through the alley, ordering all combatants to throw down their weapons and come out with their hands raised. There was no immediate response. The alley remained a tableau of stillness. The bodies of King, Valley, Chilton, and Sheets did not move. The silence stretched out, tense and vibrating. The Catfish Kid heard the sheriff's voice. He recognized the tone of authority. He tightened his grip on his rifle but did not move. He waited to see if East would fire into the shadows. He needed to be sure that the sheriff wasn't followed by a vengeful mob of LS cowboys. He watched as East signaled to Pierce. The two lawmen advanced slowly into the kill zone, their boots crunching on the glass and brass casings that littered the ground. They moved methodically, clearing the corners, their weapons leveled at chest height. As East approached the body of Ed King, he paused. He used the toe of his boot to gently nudge the shoulder of the fallen regulator. There was no reaction. East knelt briefly, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. He stood up, his face grim. He realized the magnitude of the event. This wasn't a drunken brawl, it was a decapitation of the LS Ranch leadership. He signaled to Pierce to check the others. The deputy moved toward the shack where Valley lay. The discovery of body after body confirmed the severity of the engagement. The Catfish Kid watched the lawman move deeper into the alley. They were now between him and the exit. He had them in his sights, but he had no intention of shooting. Killing the sheriff would turn the entire county against him. His war was with the syndicate, not the state. He waited until East was within 10 yards of the woodpile. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he stood up. The sound of the wood shifting caused East to spin around, the 10-gauge snapping up to target the noise. The Catfish Kid raised his hands slowly, holding the rifle by the barrel, presenting the stock to the sheriff. It was a universal gesture of submission. He spoke calmly, telling East not to shoot. He identified himself. The tension in the alley spiked for a second as East's finger hovered on the triggers of the shotgun. Pierce swung his revolver toward the woodpile. East lowered the shotgun slightly. He recognized the kid. He saw the dust on his coat and the wild look in his eyes, but he also saw the surrender. He ordered the kid to drop the weapon. The rifle fell to the dirt with a heavy thud. The kid stepped out from the woodpile, his hands held high above his head. He walked toward the sheriff, stepping over the debris of the fight. He was alive. He was unwounded. He was the sole combatant to walk away from the alley unscathed. East grabbed the kid by the shoulder, spinning him around and roughly patting him down for other weapons. He found a knife and a hideout pistol, which he confiscated. He shoved the kid toward Pierce, who secured the prisoner. East asked where the others were. The kid gestured toward the adobe shack with his chin. He told the sheriff that Woodruff was inside and that he was bad off. He mentioned the regulators were dead or gone. There was no remorse in his voice, only a factual reporting of the night's work. The lawman approached the shack. Pierce kicked the battered door open, revealing the dark interior. The beam of a lantern, which Pierce had lit, cut through the gloom. It illuminated Lem Woodruff in the corner. His face was gray, the color of wet ash. He was conscious but fading. He looked at East with a mixture of fear and relief. He wasn't going to be executed by the LS. He was going to be arrested. In his condition, arrest was a lifeline. Sheriff East assessed the situation. He had 4 dead bodies, 1 critically wounded man, and 1 prisoner. He needed a wagon. He needed the doctor. He sent Pierce to fetch the local physician and to round up some citizens to help move the bodies. East remained in the alley, guarding the scene. He stood alone with the Catfish Kid and the corpses. The wind picked up, blowing the smoke away, revealing the stark reality of the carnage. The Catfish Kid leaned against the wall of the saloon, watching the sheriff. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He began to shake, a delayed reaction to the stress. He looked at the body of Frank Valley. He had exchanged fire with that man only minutes ago. Now Valley was meat, and the kid was a prisoner. The line between the two outcomes was razor thin. As the town began to wake up, the alley filled with the murmur of voices. Men from the neighboring saloons, emboldened by the presence of the law, crept closer to see the aftermath. They stared at the bodies with morbid curiosity. They pointed at the bullet holes in the walls. They whispered the names of the dead. The legend of the fight was already beginning to form, but the reality was just blood and mud. The doctor arrived with his black bag. He went straight to Woodruff. He cut away the trousers, exposing the ugly wound. He shook his head, muttering about the damage. He administered morphine, the needle sliding into Woodruff's arm. The relief was almost instant. Woodruff's grip on the firewood loosened. The doctor called for a stretcher. Men stepped forward to help, lifting the wounded man with surprising gentleness. The catfish kid watched them carry his friend away. He knew that Woodruff's war was over. Even if he survived, he would be crippled or jailed. The system had won the night, but the cost was high. The kid looked at his own hands. They were stained with black powder and dirt. He wiped them on his trousers, leaving dark streaks on the fabric. East turned his attention to the body of Jesse Sheets. This was the complication. The killing of a bystander changed the narrative. It wasn't just a fight between willing combatants anymore. It was a crime against the peace of the community. East examined the position of the body. He looked at the angle from the shed where the regulators had been. He reconstructed the friendly fire incident in his mind. He knew this would hang the LS men if any of them were ever caught. The catfish kid saw the sheriff looking at Sheets. He spoke up, his voice raspy. He said the LS men did it. He said they shot anything that moved. He was cementing his version of the story. He was the survivor, and the survivor gets to testify. East nodded, absorbing the information but keeping his own counsel. He knew the kid was a liar and a rustler, but on this point the ballistics might agree with him. The logistics of moving the dead were grim. A wagon was backed into the alley. The horses snorted, smelling the death. The bodies were lifted one by one. Ed King, the dandy of the LS, was thrown onto the rough planks of the wagon bed. Frank Valley followed. Fred Chilton was next. Jesse Sheets was treated with more reverence, placed carefully on a blanket. The wagon creaked under the weight of the night's toll. The catfish kid was marched out of the alley ahead of the sheriff. He walked with a limp that wasn't there before, perhaps a phantom injury or just the stiffness of the cold. He was led through the crowd that had gathered on the main street. People stared at him. Some cheered, seeing him as a hero who had stood up to the corporate ranch. Others looked at him with disgust, seeing only a killer. The kid kept his head up. He had survived. That was the only victory that counted. The jail was a stone building in the upper town. It was cold and damp. The kid was placed in a cell. The iron door clanged shut, a sound of finality. He sat on the cot, listening to the voices outside. He could hear East giving orders to his deputies. He could hear the wagon rumbling toward the undertaker's parlor. The adrenaline was gone now. He felt hollowed out. Back in the alley, the silence returned. But it was different now. It was the silence of a graveyard. The ground was stained dark. The walls were scarred. The physical evidence of the fight would remain for years, marks in the adobe that would be pointed out to visitors. But the energy was gone. The spirits of the men had departed with the wagon. Sheriff East stayed at the scene for a long time. He paced the length of the alley, replaying the events. He looked at the woodpile where the kid had hidden. He marveled at the luck, or the cunning of the young gunman. To sit in a pile of logs while 3 men fired at you and to walk away without a scratch was defying the odds. East knew that the kid would be a problem for the county for a long time. The investigation began immediately. East collected the weapons that had been dropped. He found the empty casings. He noted the positions. He was building a case for the inquest. He knew that the LS Ranch would demand justice. They had money and lawyers. They would come for the kid and Woodruff. The legal battle would be just as vicious as the gunfight, but it would be fought with paper and words instead of slugs. The cold of the early morning hours was intense. Frost began to form on the edges of the water troughs. The mud in the alley began to freeze, locking the footprints and the blood trails into the earth. The violence had been hot, but the aftermath was freezing. East buttoned his coat, shivering. He was a hard man, but nights like this took a piece of his soul. The catfish kid lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. He replayed the moment in the woodpile. He remembered the sound of the bullets hitting the logs. Thwack, thwack. He remembered the smell of the pine resin. He wondered if Lang had gotten away. He hoped so. A survivor on the other side validated his own survival. It takes two sides to make a war. The town of Tascosa began to settle back into a restless sleep. The lights in the saloons were extinguished one by one. The music had stopped long ago. The only sound was the wind on the plains, blowing through the empty streets. The cowboy capital had lived up to its reputation, and the cost was 4 dead men in the dirt. As the first hint of gray light touched the eastern horizon, the scale of the event became clear. The sheer brute force of the encounter, the number of rounds fired, the reckless abandon of the combatants, it was the end of an era. The open range was closing and the violence was becoming concentrated, dense, and urban. The alley fight was not a duel. It was a slaughter. Jim East walked back to his office. He sat at his desk and began to write his report. He dipped his pen in the inkwell. He wrote the date, March 22nd, 1886. He wrote the names of the dead. He wrote the name of the prisoner, John Goff, alias the Catfish Kid. The ink was black on the white paper, a permanent record of the night the street became a war zone. The psychological terror of the standoff in the woodpile would stay with the kid. The feeling of being hunted, of being an animal in a trap, was not something that washed off with soap. He had looked death in the face and blinked. He had used the woodpile as a shield and a shroud, and when he stood up, he was reborn as a legend of the Panhandle, the man who couldn't be killed. But in the quiet of the cell, without the gun in his hand, the Catfish Kid was just a young man in a stone box. The gambit had worked. He had won the pot. But the game was far from over. The LS Ranch still had men, the courts still had judges, and the woodpile was far away. The dawn approached slowly, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. It was a fitting color scheme for the morning. The sun would rise on a town that was forever changed. The blood in the alley would dry. The holes in the walls would be patched. But the memory of the big fight would linger. A ghost story told in the saloons for generations. And at the center of that story would be the kid in the woodpile, waiting, watching, and surviving. The sun that rose over the eastern horizon of the Texas Panhandle on the morning of March 22nd, 1886, did not bring warmth to the settlement of Tascosa. Instead, the pale, watery light served only to illuminate the grisly reality of the previous night's violence, with a harsh, clinical clarity. The romanticism of the gunfight, fueled by whiskey and adrenaline in the dark, evaporated instantly under the scrutiny of the day. What remained was a dirty, wind-swept town scarred by bullet holes and stained with the dark, oxidized residue of human life. The temperature had dropped significantly during the pre-dawn hours, freezing the mud in the streets into jagged ruts that crunched under the boots of the early risers. The wind, a constant presence on the high plains, whipped through the gaps in the adobe buildings, carrying with it the faint, lingering scent of burnt sulfur and the metallic tang of the slaughterhouse. Sheriff Jim East stood in the alleyway behind the Jenkins Saloon, a space that had been a cauldron of noise and fire only hours before. In the daylight, the alley appeared smaller, narrower, and infinitely more sordid. It was not a grand battlefield. It was a garbage-strewn corridor between two mud-brick shacks. The ground was a chaotic tapestry of evidence. Brass cartridge cases glinted in the morning light, scattered like seeds across the frozen earth. Shards of glass from the shattered windows crunched underfoot. But the most dominant feature was the blood. It lay in heavy, dark pools where the bodies had fallen, now congealed and turning black, soaking into the porous soil of the town. The trails where the men had crawled or been dragged were smeared streaks of crimson, mapping out the final, desperate movements of the dead. The bodies themselves had been moved to the rear room of a local furniture store that doubled as the undertaker's parlor. Here, stripped of the shadows and the concealing coats, the true biological cost of the conflict was laid bare. The coroner and a few hastily deputized assistants began the grim task of examination and preparation. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the smell of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the distinct cloying odor of death. There was no dignity in this process. It was a mechanical inventory of damage, a tallying of the butcher's bill. Ed King, the once feared premier regulator for the LS Ranch, lay on a rough wooden table. The vanity that had defined him in life, the fine clothes, the confident swagger, was reduced to a pile of blood-soaked fabric on the floor. The wound that killed him was inspected with professional detachment. The .44 caliber slug from Lem Woodruff's rifle had entered the neck, severing the spinal column and destroying the major vessels. The exit wound was a jagged tear, evidence of the massive energy transfer. The skin around the entry was stippled with unburnt powder grains, confirming the close range of the execution. King's face, now gray and waxy, held a fixed expression of shock, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling beams. On the adjacent table lay Frank Valley. His body told the story of his reckless charge. The head wound was catastrophic. The bullet that had passed through the door of the adobe shack had struck him with enough force to deform the skull. The left side of his face was shattered. The bone structure collapsed inward. It was a brutal, ugly injury that defied the clean, heroic deaths often described in the penny dreadful novels. Valley looked small in death, his limbs stiffening with the onset of rigor mortis. His hands, still stained with gunpowder, were curled into claws, as if still trying to grip the revolver that had failed to save him. Fred Chilton occupied the third slab. His death had been less instant, but no less violent. The chest wound from the sniper's rifle was a dark puncture in the thorax. The autopsy, such as it was, revealed the massive internal trauma. The lung had been perforated, causing the chest cavity to fill with fluid. The struggle for breath in his final moments was etched onto his features, a rictus of gasping desperation. Chilton, the steady workman of the group, had been dismantled by a single well-placed shot from the darkness. His body was a testament to the lethality of the rifle in the hands of a marksman. The fourth body, that of Jesse Sheets, was the most tragic element of the morning. Sheets was not a combatant. He was a restaurateur, a man who fed the town. His body lay apart from the regulators, a physical separation that mirrored his social standing. The fatal wound to his face was from the pistol of Fred Chilton, a friendly fire incident born of panic and shadow. To see a civilian, a man in an apron and house shoes, lying dead among the gunmen was a stark indictment of the chaos that had engulfed Tascosa. His death would be the pivot point for public opinion, turning the town's sentiment from fear of the regulators to open hatred. While the dead were tended to, the survivors faced their own reckonings. Lem Woodruff, the architect of the ambush, lay in a bed in a small room near the jail, guarded by a deputy. His wound was severe, a bullet through the lower belly and groin that promised a long, agonizing recovery, or a slow death from infection. He was pale and sweating, drifting in and out of consciousness as the morphine fought the pain. The Catfish Kid sat in a cell in the stone jailhouse, uninjured but trapped. He watched the light move across the floor of his cage, listening to the sounds of the town waking up to the news. He knew that the LS Ranch would bring the full weight of its legal and financial power to bear against him. He was alive, but his freedom was forfeit. John Lang, the sole regulator to escape the kill zone, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished into the vastness of the Panhandle night, riding hard for the safety of the ranch or the railhead. His absence was a hole in the narrative, a missing piece of the puzzle. He carried with him the trauma of the night, the image of his friends dying one by one. He was the messenger of doom, the man who would have to ride to the LS headquarters and tell the managers that their private army had been wiped out in a muddy alley. The reaction of the townspeople as they emerged from their homes was a mixture of curiosity and horror. The citizens of the upper town, the merchants and the families, gathered in small knots on the boardwalks, speaking in hushed tones. They looked toward Hogtown with disdain. The violence in the lower town had always been a nuisance, but now it had spilled over into a massacre. The killing of Sheets brought the war to their doorstep. The divide between the respectable citizens and the denizens of the saloons deepened. The business owners realized that a town known for alley executions would not attract investors or the railroad. The bloodshed was bad for commerce. Hogtown, the mood was subdued. The saloons were quiet, the doors closed. The men who had cheered the gunfire the night before were now nursing hangovers and cleaning their weapons. The victory of the system over the corporate regulators was absolute, but the cost was visible in the blood on the street. They knew that retribution would come. The LS Ranch was not an entity that forgave insults. The Rangers would return, perhaps in greater numbers. The victory felt fragile, temporary. The women of the district, including the one who had lured King to his death, stayed out of sight, fearful of being implicated in the conspiracy. Sheriff East moved through the town with a grim purpose. He organized the inquest, summoning a jury from the local population. The legal machinery began to turn, grinding slowly. Witnesses were called, the bartender, the neighbors, the men who had watched from the shadows. Their testimony was recorded in the ledger. A written history of the event. The narrative that emerged was one of ambush and confusion. The sheriff knew that convictions would be hard to secure. In Tascosa, a jury of peers often meant a jury of accomplices or men too afraid to convict. By mid-morning, the carpenter was busy constructing coffins. The sound of the hammer striking nails rang out, a rhythmic wooden percussion that replaced the gunfire of the previous night. The boxes were simple, made of rough pine planks, unvarnished and unlined. There was no time or material for luxury. The dead men would go into the ground in the same clothes they died in, wrapped in blankets to soak up the fluids. The smell of the fresh sawdust mixed with the cold air, a sharp, clean scent that contrasted with the odor of the undertaker's room. The preparations for the burial were hasty. There was no desire to keep the bodies above ground any longer than necessary. The cemetery, known locally as Boot Hill, was located on a rise overlooking the river. It was a desolate patch of ground, populated by the victims of previous shootouts, accidents, and fevers. A team of diggers was dispatched to excavate the graves. The ground was hard, frozen near the surface, requiring pickaxes to break the crust. The work was brutal and physical. The men sweated in the cold, their breath steaming as they carved 4 rectangular holes in the Texas earth. The funeral procession that afternoon was a somber affair. The wagon carrying the 4 coffins creaked up the slope to the cemetery. A small crowd followed, mostly men, their hats in their hands. There were no weeping widows for the regulators, no family to mourn them. They were men of the range, ruthless and violent, and they died as they lived. Jesse Sheets had a larger contingent of mourners, neighbors who remembered him as a man who served a hot meal. The distinction in the procession was clear. 3 mercenaries and 1 victim. At the graveside, the wind howled, drowning out the few words spoken by the preacher. The coffins were lowered into the ground with ropes. The sound of the dirt hitting the wood was a final hollow thud that signaled the end of the careers of King, Valley, and Chilton. They were covered quickly, the earth mounded up to allow for settling. Wooden markers were placed at the heads of the graves, simple boards with names and the dates scrawled in paint. March 21st, 1886. The date would become a landmark in the history of the West, but for the men under the dirt, it was just the end of the line. The burial of the LS regulators marked the effective end of the ranch's attempt to control Tascosa through direct intimidation. The decapitation of their enforcement arm forced the syndicate to change tactics. They would turn to the courts, to political maneuvering, and eventually to the economic strangulation of the town. The system had won the battle of the alley, but they would lose the war for the future. The violence of the night confirmed to the railroad surveyors that Tascosa was too wild, too unstable for the main line. The tracks would go elsewhere to Amarillo, leaving Tascosa to wither and die in the desert sun. As the sun began to set on March 22nd, the town grew quiet again. The exhaustion of the event settled over the population. The adrenaline had burned out, leaving only a collective depression. The saloons in Hogtown opened, but the revelry was muted. Men drank to forget, not to celebrate. The empty spaces at the bar where King and Valley used to stand were conspicuous. The ghosts of the dead men seemed to linger in the smoke, a reminder of the fragility of life. Sheriff East sat in his office, looking at the pile of statements on his desk. He knew that the Catfish Kid would likely beat the charges. Self-defense or lack of evidence or a hung jury would see him free. Woodruff would survive to stand trial, but the outcome was uncertain. The law in the Panhandle was a flexible thing bent by power and influence. East rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of the badge. He had kept the peace as best he could, but the forces at play were larger than one man with a shotgun. The physical environment of the alley began its slow process of recovery. The blood dried and turned to dust, mixing with the earth. The wind blew sand over the stained ground, covering the evidence. The bullet holes in the adobe walls remained, dark pockmarks that would endure for decades, silent witnesses to the ferocity of the fight. The shattered windows were boarded up with rough planks. The door to the adobe shack, destroyed by Valley's bullets, was replaced. The town patched its wounds, but the scars remained. John Lang, miles away on the prairie, stopped his horse to rest. He looked back toward the horizon where Tascosa lay, invisible in the distance. He was alive, but he was a man apart. He had left his friends in the ground. The code of the regulator, the bond of the gun had been broken. He turned his horse away, riding into the anonymity of the frontier. He would tell the story, but he would never truly leave that alley. The cowboy capital of the plains had reached its zenith and its nadir in the span of 24 hours. The sheer brute force of the shootout, the relentlessness of the violence, and the finality of the execution had shocked the region. It was the last great spasm of the open-range era in that specific geography. Civilization, with its lawyers and its railroads, was coming, but it was coming over the graves of the men who had fought in the dark. Night fell again over Tascosa. The stars came out, cold and distant, indifferent to the human drama below. The coyotes began to sing in the hills, a high, yipping chorus that sounded like mocking laughter. In the cemetery on the hill, the fresh earth on the 4 graves began to freeze again. The silence of the dead was absolute. The war zone had returned to the desert. The street was empty. The fight was over. The era was done.